This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It is 4 minutes after 10. The text at the top of my inbox this morning says, "Hey LBC, do you think you could have Suella Braverman on again? It's been ages." It has been suggested that sarcasm is the lowest form of wit. I've never really bought into that theory. I enjoy a nice bit of sarcasm in the morning. Nothing sarcastic about what I'm about to say to you. I don't know how long you've been kind enough or daft enough to listen to this programme. But if I say I hate this topic, I really hate this topic, how confident would you be you could have a fair crack at guessing what it is? I mean, to be fair, it's a bit of a clue, given that I told you what we were going to be talking about obliquely, in the little talk-up before the 10 o'clock news. But I really hate this topic. I hate this topic for a number of reasons. Some of them, if you like, theoretical and academic. Some of them deeply personal. And by personal, I mean the response that the conversation can provoke in individuals listening to this programme, lovely people. I remember one from a long, long time ago. Do you ever wish you kept a diary so that you could actually have a sort of point of reference? You could pinpoint where things were and what happened. I find increasingly as I get older, my memories are a little bit vague and hazy, not always entirely reliable. But do you remember years and years and years? Well, of course you don't. You weren't listening, unless you're part of the hardy perennials. But back when no one listened to this programme, in the long, dim and distant days before Brexit, we turned our attention to a story about bosses complaining about the work ethic of young Brits. And I took one of those calls that I will always remember from a young woman who was just deeply upset. She wasn't angry and she wasn't complaining. She was just really personally upset at the portrayal of her generation, because something I didn't fully appreciate back then was that when you generalise, when you talk about trends and movements, you aren't just talking about graphs and demographics, you're talking about individuals. So, I sometimes need to say, obviously, this doesn't apply to everybody in this demographic. Obviously, this doesn't apply to everybody of that ethnicity. Obviously, this doesn't apply to everybody who is supportive of X or opposed to Y, or in a certain religion or whatever it is. But we were talking about young people having a poor work ethic, young British people having a poor work ethic, possibly in the context of immigration. And she heard a radio presenter effectively calling her lazy. I wasn't, but that's what she heard. I can't control what you hear. I can only control what I say. And she had been trying since college, trained, I think, as a graphic designer at college, currently selling popcorn in a cinema, working behind the counter in a cinema, and just really ticked off about her lack of advancement, about the fact she hadn't been able to translate her training into an actual job. And she got so upset, we invited her in. Actually into the studio, brought her portfolio with her, put her in touch with some people. That's what I mean about keeping a diary, or at least keeping in touch with people. But I always think of her when I read stories like this. The co-founder of the beer company Brewdog has said Britain is one of the least work-oriented countries in the world and called for an end to the obsession with work-life balance. It's a popular position for very wealthy people to take. They seem sometimes to forget we'd probably be all happy putting in a 50-hour week if we were taking home £5 million at the end of the year. But putting in a 50-hour week when you're on a 0-hour contract and or minimum wage and feeling pretty lethargic about it is not necessarily evidence of the absence of a work ethic or proof of laziness. I, however, wonder whether it's true. And there are two reasons for that. The first is the temptation to believe there's no smoke without fire. And this is an issue that pops up, particularly when they abolish freedom of movement for young Europeans in particular to come to this country. And it wasn't just people working in cocktail bars in London's fashionable Soho. I remember being struck by the Eastern European young women who were working at Cafe Nero in Kidderminster, where I grew up. So for good or for ill, hospitality sector lent incredibly heavily upon the beneficiaries of freedom of movement, of people. And those conversations sometimes hinged upon the question of why are you hiring Polish 20-somethings instead of British 20-somethings. So the figures weren't stunning. It wasn't like there was an epidemic of unemployment among 20-somethings or among late teenagers in this country, but they were interesting. And you would get employers suggesting, do you know, Dennis, I think she was called Poppy. Blimey heck, mate, well done. Absolute top of the class for Dennis. And you had to ask the question. You didn't like some of the answers, most of the research shows that claims by people like Farage that sort of immigration was responsible for wage compression were almost entirely false, except in a couple of sectors. I think most notably haulage, perhaps. But you would think, well, the reason why you can't find a chef is because you're not paying them enough money. But you are also conscious. Isn't it funny that when you talk about the costs that businesses face in the context of, well, they should pay more to hire staff, then a certain type of politician or commentator will say, you don't understand what it's like to run a business. We can't pay more. We pay what we afford. And then, of course, when it comes to being required to pay a little bit more into the public pot via national insurance, suddenly none of these businesses can afford to operate or stay open. And it's absolutely ridiculous to demand that they pay a little bit more into the infrastructure of the country that provides them with both staff, customers and a supply chain. I digress slightly. And Victoria, I think, challenging Dennis for top of the class this morning, because this speaks to the Poppy in Reading, says Chris. You're absolutely right. Good God, you people make me feel a bit forgetful on occasions. And Dennis says, I had to spell her name out. My smart speaker kept thinking I was calling her Puppy. I'm looking at Victoria's comment, which is really interesting and speaks directly to where I am at the moment. She says, you can tell the generation gap between us, James. I'm 32. You're all right, don't rub it in, Victoria. Only one of us had a birthday this week. Because I hear that the country is not work-oriented, and I think good. And that is where this topic, this conversation, feeds into the conversation that is becoming one of the most popular that we have on the programme, one of the most common that we have on the programme. And it's a conversation about economic inactivity and the question of motivation and the argument that the social contract has been breached, which was raised again by, I think, Susie, definitely in Crete. I think her name was Susie, speaking yesterday about why the social contract has been breached. And looking at why young people were a little bit more drawn to dictatorships than older people, but focusing in on that sense of having been let down, even to the point of having been betrayed by the system. And it played also into a story that the Green Party were promoting yesterday, after a calculation showed that a 21-year-old in Bristol renting a single room would, by their 30th birthday, have handed £80,000 to their landlord. Do you ever notice, I'm sure you do, because it was Susan, well, maybe she's Susie to her friends, who knows. Have you ever noticed how gleeful I get when I stumble across something that I think is a really helpful insight, like a penny drop moment? I don't know if you were listening on the day when I found myself realising, and don't laugh at me, if you realised this 100 years ago, better late than never is always my defence. I found myself realising that an awful lot of people who were being described by the media and by politics as being unable to afford homes, or crucially unable to buy their own homes, unable to buy homes even, unable to buy homes, were actually buying homes. Just not for themselves. They were buying homes for older, I'm not mad about the depiction boomer, but generally from that generation who had enjoyed unparalleled economic health and ended up with enough capital to either buy outright or get a loan to buy a property, which then someone who was never going to get onto the property ladder because of the consequences of the 2008 financial crash earned enough to pay every month the payments that they needed to buy the home. So huge swathes of the population, the working population, going to work every day to buy somebody else a house, to buy somebody else a flat. And I don't think I appreciated at the time how wide the ramifications of that might prove to be. Because if you want to pick apart the breaking of the social contract for young people, I do believe, and this is partly linked to how I was raised, but I was raised like a lot of people. I do believe that robbing the younger generations of a realistic hope of becoming homeowners in their 20s and 30s will explain why the relationship with work seems to have changed. Which brings us to somebody called James Watt, the co-founder of the beer company Brewdog, describing Britain as one of the least work-oriented countries in the world. He is going out with someone called Georgia Toffolo, who is known for her time on Made in Chelsea, which is, I don't know where that fits in the great annals of work-life balance or work ethic, but I believe that the people on that program get paid, and then they can get paid to go to parties and promote things. And as I would say, again, nice work if you can get it. The whole concept of work-life balance was invented by people who hate what they do, he said. So if you love what you do, you don't need work-life balance, you need work-life integration. And it is the Britishness of young people that he focuses on, calling this country the least work-oriented, or one of the least work-oriented countries in the world. As a nation, we love to joke about the French being lazy. Do we? Have you ever joked about the French being lazy? Have you ever joked about the French? Well, no, again, interesting. But the reality is that our output per hour is 13% lower than theirs. I think a figure that many would attribute to differences in investment over the last 30 or 40 years. Productivity, of course, linked to wherever it is that you're working and the ease, if you like, of producing. But it adds to the notion that the UK's work ethic doesn't stack up against other nations. He even says, I've heard countless international leaders say the UK's work ethic doesn't stack up against other nations, especially the US. And he does, in his defence, make the point I made at the outset. This isn't to say that nobody in the UK works hard, but... And then he's very upset that he received some abuse for suggesting that millions of young people lack a work ethic. And one can never be in favour of the nastiest elements of online abuse. But this suggestion that young British people lack a work ethic is one that I want to examine. And you can tell, you can hear my defensiveness, right? Partly because of Poppy and people like her back in the day. I'd have gone in on this a lot harder, possibly even with my studs up. I used to do that. I almost don't recognise the person that used to present the programme back then. Well, in my day, I did this, and in my day, I did that. These young people today don't know they're born. Honestly, I'd have put my hand up for everything. I was running errands for the boss left, right and centre. I'd be going in 2 hours early and coming home 2 hours late. I didn't take lunch breaks. And I bought my first home at 28. Take that out of the equation and you kind of wonder whether or not the other bits would still be in place. 17 minutes after 10 is the time. As an employer, however heavy your heart may be, if you're going to answer yes to this question, and however more welcome you may be if you're going to answer no, as an employer, do young British people have, am I going to say a problem with work? Could this be a bigger part than perhaps we've previously appreciated of that economic inactivity conundrum that we try to riddle out on a weekly, if not a monthly, if not a weekly basis on the programme? As an employer, or indeed a parent, as an employer or a parent, does this character have a point when he suggests that young British people need to be more work-oriented, and that worrying about the work-life balance is a luxury that they should not be afforded? So parents and employers and young people, you talk about yourself or you can talk about your peers and your contemporaries. So this fella, I don't know how much he's worth. It's probably a mistake of the Times newspaper, who I'm relying on for my information here, to not include what his own personal wealth may be. It's got to have an impact on what your work-life balance feels like. And I should probably remind you as well that in 2021, former employees accused this company of having a, quotes, culture of fear, end quotes, with, quotes, toxic attitudes to junior staff. Watt apologised and insisted the group had made changes. So I am aware of that. I'm also aware of what litigation looks like. So this isn't a conversation about any of that. It's a conversation about laziness. He's calling young British people lazy. It's right. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 10:19.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 21 minutes after 10. I found an article from 2024 in which this character accusing young people in Britain of being lazy or lacking a work ethic is estimated to be worth, wait for it, shall I do a hook and tease? I think I've got this right. I'm just double checking that. It's 242 million pounds. I don't know whether that influences your attitude to his intervention in this space, but 262 million pounds, with Brewdog having overtaken Carlsberg in 2022 in the international hit parade of beer producers. I've always been more of a Beavertown man myself, I must be completely honest, not least because Beavertown has fascinating and rather surprising links to my hometown of Kidderminster, which I may share with you one day. But what do we think? I mean, has he got a point? Obnoxious though the expression of the opinion may be, and difficult though it may seem to take lessons on work-life balance from a man worth £262 million, is Britishness part of the problem that we're examining here? Julian is in Chipping Sodbury. Julian, what would you like to say?
I was just saying to your researcher that there's no reason for people to work hard these days, young people, the majority of the population, because what are they working for? They're not working to be able to afford a house. They're not working to be able to afford to have children. You know, there's many things that have an effect, but I think one of the reasons is there's no reward.
You work to survive.
Yes.
It's gone back to a sort of 19th century model where, you know, the next thing to happen would be a workhouse, so that if you fall out of that work to survive mode, you literally rely upon the charity of the parish. There's no real prospect of carving out security for you and your children for the future.
Something amusing that I read was that they were saying that medieval serfs had more free time and time with their families because of religious holidays than people working today. And I mean,
unlike Mark Zuckerberg, I'm still a fan of fact checking, so I can't let that go completely unchallenged. It sounds persuasive, but then I would play in the Downton Abbey model when you only got Boxing Day off. You could put in a 364 days a year, because the alternative was hunger. The alternative was starving to death. That's why the Foundling Hospital. I'm doing an event later today with the charity that grew out of the Foundling Hospital set up by Thomas Coram, because young women couldn't keep their children and families couldn't afford to keep children. They'd hand them over. When did you arrive at this conclusion? Because how old are you, Julian, if you don't mind me asking?
I am 61.
So your generation traditionally would have been the most likely, perhaps, to think that young people needed a kick up the backside. Has it been a slow realisation that things aren't that simple, or have you known this for a long time now?
For quite a while now.
Right.
You know, I'm in a very comfortable financial position, and it has always amazed me the number of people, my compatriots, that just don't have any recognition of how tough life is when you haven't got a bit of money behind you.
Yeah, that's really nicely put, recognising the role that luck plays in all of our lives. But sometimes it's the luckiest people in the world who are the least likely to acknowledge luck has played a part in their comfort, their security or their success. You get it a lot with the private schools conversation, of course. I work bloody hard, send my children to private. Well, how hard do you think these people work on 0-hour contracts and minimum wage? You think they're phoning it in? 25 minutes after 10 is the time. But what does it look like? What are the consequences of this in the actual job interview or on the actual shop floor or in the actual pub? Two things can be right at the same time. There can be an epic generational unfairness in play here, but as an employer, that's not your fault. It might be your problem, but it's not your fault. What does it actually look like in the context of people turning up looking for work? And why would a young person from France or Poland be more enthusiastic and more employable than somebody from, I don't know, Birmingham or Bolton? Sandra is in Richmond. Sandra, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello,
so I've been an employer for over 30 years now, and I have seen a big change in terms of, so I employ from all sorts of age group. I have a cleaning company. We did speak during COVID, actually, and we just discussed about, how it was affecting things and how it had been a reset.
Not well,
anyway,
if I recall.
Yes, it did. What's been very interesting is, for an example, I have staff, for instance, yesterday, quite a few of them get the tram in, and 5 of them got in 5, and the youngest one rang saying, quite late, saying that she couldn't get on the tram because it was too busy. And I, had to ring her later and say, look, there's no point coming in now because we're now in a situation where all the staff have gone out. It's just too much hassle with the traffic to get you over to join a team. So let's speak later. So I spoke to her and I said, I'm not your teacher. Where we are right now is that you have to, if you can't get on the tram, 5 other people did. So I'm not suggesting you didn't have your problems. But she also rang a little while ago saying that she couldn't come into work because the trains weren't running and it gave her anxiety. And I said, well, it gives me anxiety when you're ringing me a day in advance. There is this mindset. Also, a lot of them are on universal credit, which means they are topped up very early on and they don't feel a need to work.
How much is universal credit for somebody like that?
Well, so for an example, they have to earn around 185 a week. When I say they don't do full days, so hours would be that they earn a very good rate per hour because that's the whole point of being fully employed. But roughly, I think it doubles up what their money. If they earn a penny over what their limit is,
you haven't told me how much she would get in universal credit without doing any work.
Oh, I can't tell that specific one, but I can tell another member.
I'm a little reluctant to conclude that is part of the reason why she's saying that she's anxious because she doesn't need the money, so therefore she can pretend that she's anxious. I mean, anxiety can be crippling. I appreciate.
No, I absolutely understand that. So I can give you an example of another member staff, which I do know where.
And what age category are we talking about?
So this particular member staff is about 19.
Okay.
So the other member staff is a little bit older. She obviously she works 4 days a week, and her top up is around 1,200 a month on those 4 days that she works. So
okay, I mean the monthly standard allowance on universal credit if you're single and under 25 is £311.
Well, there you go. So
a month.
She's that sounds about right.
Not 1,200.
No, that's for the other member of staff. I did say that.
Well, if you're over 25, it's £393.
There are other things that come into play if you've got children as well. So they obviously top that up on that, which I have no problem with at all. It's a good thing. It's more the fact that she's an example and she's lovely. When she works hard. But it's more that it's almost like the things that they lack is things like the courtesy of saying, I'm going to be late much earlier on. So if you're going to be late into work, that you call in advance to say that there are problems here. But everything is...
And what do we compare this to, Sandra? Well, I mean, when would the golden age have been? Listen, I'm giving you a mildly hard time, but I
understand that.
Generationally, I recognise what you describe. And I was going to work at River Island in Worcester. If the train was late, I had to get a letter off the bloody station master to show it to the manager, who was a bit of a tyrant anyway. And I might have felt aggrieved by that, but that was normal. I don't know when was the golden age.
I have people. I would say at the moment, people in their 30s upwards seem to have a more considered approach to their work it's sort of in etiquette for coming to work. So they have more, I suppose, they're more capable of letting you know what's going on.
And how do you respond to the suggestion that you can't really blame these young people for not being as motivated as we were when we were their age, because
I agree.
The rewards on the table bear no comparison whatsoever to what we could realistically expect.
We have messed up massively. I would say education is part of it. The education system is part of it. I think COVID had a huge part to play, and I don't want to keep coming back to that, but that did make a big difference. There were 3, 4, 5 months of the time that they didn't work at all, And I believe also the whole thing with social media.
There's a lot going on, isn't there?
Yeah,
and I'm glad we've ended this conversation with you coming from a place of sympathy as well as a place of critique, because I think we need both. Clearly, we need both. But that idea of young people wondering what the point is, and our generation not really being able to tell them. 0345 6060 973 is the number. I wonder if anyone can compare it to other countries, because this chap from Brewdog is adamant that whenever he travels the world, international leaders are always telling him that the UK's work ethic doesn't stack up against other nations. And this won't be confined to young people. That's the way I've chosen to conduct the conversation. He's talking about everybody. He's talking about you. He's talking about me. Apparently, international leaders are adamant that the UK's work ethic doesn't stack up against other nations, especially the US. Any international leaders listening? Anyone qualified to comment on whether or not there is actually some truth in this outwardly quite obnoxious and unpatriotic observation? It's 10:31 and Dominic Ellis is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:35. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I guess, and it doesn't bode well, does it, if this is the case, given the current nature of public discourse in this country. But I mean, the Brewdog man could be wrong. He could be right about something, but wrong about the reasons. There may be a peculiarly British malaise in play here. I think I saw property prices something like 40% against the median across the rest of Europe, 40% higher, 40% more out of reach for young people. You'd have to compare it to average wages, of course. But the idea that there is something peculiarly British about the relationship with work could be true. But the reasons for it would not be a lack of motivation or laziness. It would be a lack of purpose. It would be genuinely surveying the workplace, acknowledging the horizon, looking what is ahead, and wondering what the point is. And the younger you are, arguably, the bleaker the outlook. I don't know. But of course, the bloke from Brewdog is not talking exclusively about young people. We should probably acknowledge that in some of the future callers. He's talking about everyone in Britain. He's saying the entire country is one of the least work-oriented countries in the world. If you want to tell me that he's right, and you can tell me how you know that, don't be shy. Listen, it's absolutely not the case that just because I don't want something to be true, that I would be incapable of acknowledging that you know more about it than I do. So 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Ash is in Watford. Ash, what do you think?
Hi, James. I agree with this because I'm a parent. I'm a manager in a retail company. I've got 30 years worth of experience, both in the UK and abroad as well. And I've certainly seen from the British staff are definitely a lot lazier. The reason I say that is because I've worked with them, and I've certainly seen a lot of that over, I'd say, 25, 30 years. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some amazing colleagues in there. There's some really, really good colleagues in there that work really hard on there. But I don't think sometimes, I think you touched on that point about purpose. Some of them don't see that. Some of them don't see the end game. I mean, when I first started retail, I had 3 jobs. And I wanted to work hard. I wanted to get a house.
But you could.
Sorry?
You could get a house. You could work 3 jobs now and it wouldn't be within reach because you'd have to save up the deposit, which we didn't have to save up when we were young.
Yeah, you're right. But only if you're doing the same job right now and do that for the next 20 years. But, if you think outside the box and think, I can progress in this business, I can do it.
Well, maybe, but I mean, it wouldn't make property prices come down, would it? At a rate of knots, it wouldn't make them anything like akin to the relationship between income and property prices that was commonplace when we were younger. I go back even further, and you could buy a house with 3 times your annual salary. I don't know what that multiple is now, but it's eye-watering. But there's obviously something in what you say. And can I ask what sort of shop you work in? What sort of retail?
It's a retailer. It's like supermarket retail.
I love retail. I don't know if you know that. If I hadn't done this, I think I would hopefully have ended up in a senior position because I love the philosophy of it, the psychology. I love all of it. But my local supermarkets now, and I can say this because I'm there every day, the preponderance of the staff in my local supermarket since Brexit has slowly shifted to Asian people, but who, because I speak to them, were mostly not born here. And they are finding something in that workplace that you're suggesting British people wouldn't find. So how are they managing to thrive and flourish, as it were, given that the pay that's on offer and the city in which they live is the same as the one that their British counterparts live in, their British-born counterparts live in?
Yeah, I see that as well. I wouldn't say obviously, I know there is a lot of Asian people in there, but at the same time, you do have a balance across. Certainly the retailers I worked in.
But I guess what I'm saying is, if I was to come here from Bangladesh or from India, I would find a work offer that I found attractive in a supermarket in London. And if I had grown up in that part of London, and this is a massive generalisation because my local supermarkets, as you say, are diverse, but I don't come across many Eastern European kids anymore, and I do come across a lot of older, slightly older Asian people from overseas. What are they getting? I mean, when we used to have conversations like this before Brexit, people would tell me that they were sleeping 20 to a room or something like that. I never quite bought into that idea, but the staff you hire, you don't get offered a different package according to where you were born or what your star sign is. Everybody gets offered more or less the same package. Why is it more attractive to people who weren't born here than it is to people who were?
Well, it's probably more attractive because, you're right, the pay's the same and they probably do live 4 or 5 to a house or a room because it's cheaper that way. But then
you're not offering enough money to the British people to make the work seem worthwhile to them.
No, I don't think so, because the reason these guys are obviously working harder is because there's overtime and hours left on the table by the British workers in there, and they'll happily take them.
Right. So you can make it work for you by putting in a 50-hour week.
Yeah, of course, and you have to. You got to look at your own individual.
I think you're right. I think you do have to. But if I'm 19 and a 50-hour week is the only way I can make ends meet, why am I alive?
50 hour. I wouldn't say 50 hours is excessive, to be honest. The average is 40. So if you do work 50, you'll obviously be compensated. I hear you,
and I have some sympathy for your position, and I think I would probably be a bit more like you in the same circumstances, but I've got a little bit more sympathy for people looking at minimum wage or thereabouts, calculating it, timesing it by 50 and thinking, what's the bloody point? I'll have no life at all, and that's all I'll have at the end of the month.
But you are right, James, right? If you calculate that by 50 and calculate that by 20 years of doing the same job, of course you're going to be static. You're going to be in the same position. But within that, there is several roles you can work towards.
Yeah, but only for a small number of people.
No.
There's only one manager. There's only one general manager in a shop, and then half a dozen duty managers, and then 50 people on the shop floor, 50 foot soldiers.
You certainly know your retail well, don't you?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be in that retailer. It could be somewhere else.
Only because they put the photo in the front of the shop every day, so I know who's in charge before I say hello. So I'm not arguing with you. And I admire what you describe. I just think it makes less and less sense with each passing generation. The rewards that we've accrued and the work that we've done. I'm a bad example because my situation is freakish, obviously freakish. But I do still oddly have, as you can tell, an affection for and an affinity for retail. And I don't know that I would. Certainly the people I worked for in retail, whether it was in Worcester or whether it was on Regent Street in London, that the management had really good packages, really good lives, but I don't know now that their equivalent would, and certainly not the people who were working at my level. Speaking of retail, a quick shout to Joan, who gets to go into Idiot's Corner this morning. She suggests I'm sneering at the bloke from Brewdog for being so rich, and at least he didn't get his break as a consequence of his late father opening doors for him, which I think is an accusation being levelled at me. Listen, having a father who was a journalist meant that when I arrived in newspaper offices, I might know people, or even I'd know how to behave. I'd know the lingo. I'd know that it gave me a degree of confidence. So did private school. But I got my actual break in journalism as a consequence of selling a suit to John Major while I was working in retail on the shop floor of Aquascutum on Regent Street. And I phoned up the Daily Express with details of the story and asked if I could have shifts instead of a cheque, instead of payment for the story. So I mean, it's fascinating that you've gone to the trouble of inventing an origin story for me that is not true. I'm always very, very open about privilege and luck and the role that both have played in my life. But I'm afraid, Jane, that one's simply not true. Although I've got a sneaking suspicion you probably don't care. It's coming up to 11:15, staying with some of this. And again, the suggestion from Ash, which I think was made in good faith, 50 hours a week isn't that much. But Andy points out, where the hell are people going to find an extra 2 hours a day? They're taking 2 hours a day to get to and from work. That'll be 12 hours of their day going to and from work. And factor in sleep and eating, and you would literally do nothing else. Now, in your teens, in your 20s, maybe, if you felt like you were really putting away cash for the future, you'd do those sort of shifts. But if you were only earning enough to essentially survive, would you really? I don't know, but there's a lot more going on here than the bloke from Brewdog seems to appreciate. I would cautiously suggest 10:45 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:47. Pierre writes, as a foreigner, my take is that we take what work we can and we work harder or more hours because we have black tax to consider. Black tax being supporting our families back home and ourselves when here. That's our purpose, I suppose. I think British people have support systems, family, etc., so they have the option, they have more choice over what they do or don't do, and we simply don't. We have to do what we do to get to where we want to get. Whether it's building a home in our original countries or providing for our extended families. The British don't have to do this. There's something there, you know, and I think if you play in the serfdom parallel that our first caller took, 61-year-old Brit, Julian, describes himself as financially very comfortable, but incredibly sympathetic to people 40 years younger than him over what they might realistically achieve by working incredibly hard. If you are achieving a degree of security or comfort in another country by working incredibly hard here for 10 years and not having much of a life outside of that 10-year window, then it would make sense. But if you're living here for the rest of your life, it doesn't make any sense at all. You just spend 10 years breaking your back and have next to nothing to show for it at the end. I don't know. I mean, you know, this is why these conversations can be so interesting. But the idea that Britain is one of the least work-oriented countries in the world, clearly meant as a pejorative, a wake-up call, an attack, I think, upon this country by the co-founder of a beer company called Brewdog, a very successful British company, albeit one with a very checkered past in terms of allegations made by former employees. He is clearly saying that the problem is Britishness. It doesn't mean he's wrong just because we don't like hearing it. Graham is in Macclesfield. Graham, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Nice to talk to you again. Greetings from sunny Macclesfield.
It's not sunny. It's never sunny in Macclesfield.
No, it is today, my friend. It is today.
I don't believe Fake news. Fake news. Yeah. It's the biggest crowd at the inauguration in Macclesfield. Go on, what do you want to say?
I don't share this experience.
Good.
We have a manufacturing company in Holmes Chapel in Cheshire where we're making components for lithium-ion batteries for electric cars.
Wow.
So we are, I suppose, in a sense, we're fortunate and we're in a high-tech sector. But
yes,
we've grown over the last 2.5, 3 years from 3 of us to 28.
Okay, so you're a success story, and who
now, yeah.
Who and what do you hire?
Most of our employees, I would say 3/4 of our employees are under 30.
Right.
They are fabulous, excellent workers, dedicated. They will willingly go the extra mile if they need to in terms of getting product out of the door.
And they're British young people.
They're local people, yeah.
Yeah, local people. Local jobs for local people.
Yeah, and I mean, we employ some older people as well, and they are exactly the same. There is no problem in work ethic. There is no problem in application. I think the problem lies with the employers.
Go on.
Because I think it's down to culture. And we when we set up our business, we set it up with a particular culture which treats people as individuals. It treats them with respect. It treats them fairly. It pays them fairly for what they do. And the response to that, the reward to that, is an increase in productivity.
And this fascinates me, because the initial response to this from a certain type of employer, or indeed a certain type of commentator and politician, would be to say, well, that means you get less money. The more
we probably do.
And that is, that's not how capitalism is supposed to work.
Well, it's the way our sort of capitalism works.
So you don't suffer from... Go on.
We're quite content to...
I love that word.
Not to, if you like, fully maximise the potential profit.
Because you want a happy and fulfilled workforce.
We want a happy and fulfilled workforce. And we have employees who are currently buying houses. And
it could cut the other way. So you're clearly paying a good quality salary to people who need qualifications.
I mean, we are employing. We've got a couple of PhDs, but we've got people with degrees. We've got people who haven't got degrees. Right across the piece, through research and development down to the manufacturing shop.
You sound like a great boss, and you remind me a little of James Timpson.
Do you know, I'm a massive admirer of James.
I thought you might be. Because he goes further than you. He thinks his company is more profitable as a consequence of all the things they do to look after their workforce than it would be if they didn't.
I would agree with him. I read his book. It's superb.
It is, isn't it? And I mean, for people who don't know, it's not just the cobbler companies that you've got on your high street. He owns a variety of businesses, always looking to expand. But the effort and the care they put into looking after their workforce, it probably gets less attention than the fact that he gives a lot of prison leavers a chance to rehabilitate themselves and find work. But everybody who works for him gets looked after, and he thinks it's good business. But he tells me he could sit at a dinner table with other chief executives. They'll think he's bonkers. But then when he talks them through the bottom line, he can almost back up. Well, he can back up his theory that a happy workforce is a more productive workforce, and therefore a more profitable company, and therefore a bigger payout for the bosses.
Yeah, absolutely. Our factory is the only one in the Western world making the components that we make. There's nobody outside of China.
Long may it continue. Long may it continue. Did you grow up in Holmes Chapel?
I grew up in Wilmslow, actually.
So you didn't go to school with Harry Styles then?
No, I didn't go to school with Harry Styles. No,
I wouldn't be surprised if someone on your workforce did, just by the law of averages.
and I'm not quite sure about that, but
it's the viaduct, right? Holmes Chapel. It's the viaduct.
It's the
beautiful, beautiful part of the world. A lot of people getting in touch asking him if they could. Ben wants your phone number. He wants to apply for a job with you.
Yeah. So am I allowed to say who we are?
Yeah, of course you are, mate. I was about to invite you to do so.
Thank you very much, James. I wouldn't do it without asking you.
Oh, good man.
The company is called Avocet, A-V-O-C-E-T, like as in the bird.
Love it.
And it's Avocet Materials Group. And we have two companies, Avocet Battery Materials, where we make components for lithium-ion batteries, and Avocet Precision Metals, where we do trading, importing metals from abroad and supplying manufacturing industry. And we have a massively talented team, and we have a highly dedicated team, and a highly productive team, and a great bunch of people. Well, I'm so proud to be part of them.
I can tell it shines out. It comes across. Now, if anyone ends up working for you as a consequence of this little exchange, then you better be on your marks, mate. Because if you turn out not to be, I'm sure you will. I'm only teasing. And there's a brilliant full disclosure episode with James Timpson as well. Actually, if you want to hear a little bit more about his ethic and this fascinating idea that we're looking at the whole conversation through the wrong end of the telescope. And again, it's probably relevant to some of the allegations and accusations made about Brewdog, toxic attitudes, cultures of fear, junior staff queuing up to complain. I do remember elements of that story. And then that for a boss who has apologised and insisted that the group has made changes since 2021. But I wonder if he'd have had a more work-oriented experience. I wonder if he'd have experienced more work-oriented colleagues if the working environment was like the one that Graham has just described in sunny Macclesfield. 10:56 is the time. Jason is in Acton. Jason, what would you like to say?
It's now making me wonder whether there's a bit of a north-south divider with this problem.
Well, it's only one. That's one factory in Macclesfield, mate. It's not time to draw a line across the country around about Leicester.
It is, but there's 200 people on a train on the way to Macclesfield now just because they want to get a job there.
Yeah, there might be. What made you pick up the phone?
What made me pick up the phone is that we employ generally young people because we make crepes or pancakes outside the London Palladium, and it's a pretty tough job, and it's mainly younger people that want to do the job, except they don't want to do the job after a couple of weeks of doing the job. And part of my theory of this is that a lot of the younger people are either at university or they've been to university and they've been given quite a lot of money to sometimes not doing an awful lot of work.
Well, they've borrowed a lot of money.
They've borrowed a lot of money, but they don't seem to
understand. That's a really important distinction. They've got 30 or 40 grand's worth of debt.
Correct, but they don't understand what debt really is.
Right, because they don't have to pay it back until they start earning over a certain threshold.
Correct, and they're not worried about it because when they're receiving the money, they're not using the money for what it probably should have been designed for because there's nobody controlling that.
Well, most of it goes on tuition fee. I mean, don't turn me into Jeremy Paxman on a nice friendly chat like this, but most of it's going to go on tuition fees, and then the money that they have to borrow for their living expenses will go on living expenses.
In theory, but then a lot of the people that we employ are living at home, but they get the same amount of money whether they're living at home or whether they're actually renting accommodation.
So that's still going on living expenses, but what we would consider to be luxuries rather than necessities.
Correct.
Yeah,
so they're used to having money in their bank account without actually working for it. So then all of a sudden they've got to work, and funnily enough, their mentality isn't quite the same.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with you. I want to, but you're there. Hiring these people.
James, what's wrong with you?
Well, do you know why? I think that the cat lady. Did you hear me talking about my mate who's a hairdresser?
Yeah.
And he took it, and he's such a lovely bloke that he speaks to me with this sense of absolute wonder. He cannot believe that this stuff is happening. And this was a young woman he'd offered really nice terms to be an apprentice, and she asked if she had to come in every day because her neighbours, for people who don't know, Jason remembers, her neighbours had got a new cat, and there might be occasions when she had to look after it at short notice, and it's so comical, and it can't be used to paint or to tarnish an entire generation. But if that's an extreme, then there's a whole graph leading up to it, isn't there?
Absolutely.
And I'd have to say, if you are living at home, you're not entitled to the same amount of living loans, but you're still entitled to something. So you've got your facts a bit wrong there.
That's if they're declaring that they're.
Well, now you're accusing them of being fraudsters and liars. I mean, it's bad enough. It's bad enough calling them lazy, Jason.
I'm just pointing out the fact.
So, who do you hire?
Well, at the moment, we've got one very, very nice young lady, and she's worked out extremely well. And if you're ever at the London Palladium, please come and have a crepe. You can have one on the house.
That's very kind of you. And where is your current successful staff member from? If you don't have to tell me, I don't want to embarrass.
No, she's from Croydon.
Oh, there you go.
But she's good, and the other two girls I had, they were friends. One of them got the sack. I had to pay her a fortune in redundancies. The other one went out of her way to get the sack, which she told the other girl she was going to purposely do just so she could get free money. And you have to pay it to them. No matter what they do, you have to give them the money if you're going to dismiss somebody.
So, yeah, I mean, the difficulties of being a boss, relatively well documented, but difficulties of being an employee, perhaps sometimes overlooked. Thank you, Jason. And if you're going to the London, what's on at the moment? Is it still the pantomime? The pantomime finished on Sunday.
Well done, yeah, it finished on Sunday. So there's nothing there this week, and it all starts again, nothing this weekend.
Okie dokie. If you're going to the London Palladium, or indeed if you're in the vicinity of Carnaby Street and you fancy a crepe, put some business Jason's way. There's you don't need a name check, do you? You can have one if you want, but there's only one crepe stall outside.
No, there's only one good one, Flip Express.
Flip Express, well done. Here's a question. Do you remember Ian the Ice Cream Man, who came up with what I think is the best question of the year so far? It was last year, wasn't it? Ian the Ice Cream Man, when I was talking to someone after the national insurance announcements were made, and he was saying how he was going to have to shut down one of his bars because of the cost of... And I'm not saying he wasn't telling me the truth, not for a moment. You know me, I try to be all things to all people. But Ian the Ice Cream Man texted me, who I know Ian, that's why I call him Ian the Ice Cream, and he delivers ice cream, funnily enough, to all the great venues in the West End. I don't know whether he delivers to the London Palladium or not. Jason probably knows him. But he just texted me, and he said, ask him what car he drives. So the bloke was telling us that the national insurance increases that he was going to have to pay on behalf of his staff would compel him to close down one of his venues. And I think the car he drove was worth £80,000. So I like these questions when they come in. Well, not least because it involves you doing my job while I'm the one that gets paid. But here's another one from No Hostages. I'll leave this one hanging as we head to the news. If James Watt's workers are so terrible, why is he so rich?
James O'Brien on LBC.
5 minutes after 11 is the time. Jason and his crepe stall isn't offering a career to his employees. He's just offering a job. Avocet, which was the previous caller, is offering long-term careers to their employees. I think Jason needs to understand the difference, suggests Jane. And quite a few people pointing out that you don't have to pay redundancy if you get fired. But we didn't have the time to go into all of the detail of that situation. We must talk about Tulip Sadiq as well. I told you the clock was ticking. I didn't know it was ticking quite so loudly because I didn't know that the advisor on ethics was going to report back quite so quickly. So I said to you yesterday, Starmer will follow process, and he has. It just happened to unfold a little quicker than some people might have been expecting. Make no mistake, this was a stupid appointment by Keir Starmer. You cannot appoint someone to a corruption role, or you really shouldn't appoint someone to a corruption role who is even vaguely adjacent to corruption or potential corruption in other territories. I've told you a couple of times, I hope no one tells him, it would be embarrassing, but Stephen Bush of the Financial Times is fast becoming my favourite commentator, and rather happily, he's incredibly active on Blue Sky, the social media platform to which many of us are now migrating from X or Twitter or whatever it's called this week. I think he says everything that needs to be said. Tulip Sadiq has resigned from the government. I don't have all that much to say other than not before time. It was obviously untenable for the government's anti-corruption minister to be the subject of not one but two corruption probes herself. Keir Starmer's sluggishness in acting to remove one of his longest-standing allies, in stark contrast to the swift exit of Louise Haigh. I heard Farage lying about that earlier, claiming that Starmer had dithered over both of these dismissals, whereas in fact it's arguably more politically effective to point out that he was loyal to his friend and very quick to get rid of the person with whom he's not perceived to be a close ally. But as Bush points out, it makes it look like standards of behaviour in government are on a sliding scale of how quickly you rallied behind his leadership in the winter of 2019. It's exactly the kind of thing his government was meant to represent a breach from. So, important to register all of that, but also important because this is one of the only corners of the media where you can get this sort of information. It's also important to remember two things. The first is that the reason why Tulip Sadiq was able to refer herself to the advisor on ethics was because Keir Starmer, very early in his premiership, introduced the ability, the freedom to do so. So in stark contrast with Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, he actually had ethics advisors. And in an update to the ministerial code, he meant that the advisor would be able to launch investigations into ministerial wrongdoing without seeking the consent of Sir Keir Starmer. This is really, really important stuff. And I wish other people pointed it out to you. Particularly people who stayed silent when a long list of Conservative MPs were found to have breached the ministerial code and yet stayed in their jobs and were helped to stay in their jobs by people like Boris Johnson. This is a massive improvement to transparency that has ended up biting Keir Starmer on the backside because he was silly enough to put someone in a corruption role who has, and he could have foreseen some problems, if not all of them, who has ended up being the subject of not one but two corruption probes herself. But the new version of the code says that the Prime Minister will normally give consent, but reserved the right to raise concerns about an investigation if there are public interest reasons for doing so. But Tulip Sadiq could refer herself to this advisor, Sir Laurie Magnus, in the event of the kind of situation that has grown up over the last couple of weeks. So this, if you care about facts, this stuff is important. And speaking of facts, off the top of my head, Gavin Williamson was found by the Court of Appeal to have acted unlawfully when he removed safeguards for children in care at the start of the pandemic without consulting children's rights organisations. Under Boris Johnson's premiership, he stayed in his job. Michael Gove was found to have broken the law by awarding a £560,000 contract to a communications company called Public First, run by associates of himself and Dominic Cummings. High Court ruling described the decision as tainted by, quotes, apparent bias and was unlawful. There was also a condemnation from the Information Rights Tribunal for Gove's department over a profound lack of transparency in a ruling over freedom of information blacklisting claims. Robert Jenrick, you'll remember, the Housing Secretary, accepted in May 2020 that his assistance to his role in helping a Tory party donor avoid paying £45 million was unlawful. Jenrick and Gove stayed in their jobs. And my favourite example of this was Priti Patel, who I think was only being investigated because Theresa May would have referred it, was found by the independent investigator Alex Allen to have fallen below the standards expected of her in office. In other words, this was the bullying allegation. This wasn't the thing that Theresa May fired her for. She was found by an investigation to have broken the ministerial code by bullying Whitehall staff. The independent investigator found that she had done so. But of course, she didn't just stay in her job, but Boris Johnson sent a WhatsApp group round saying we need to form a square around the Pritster. So such is the corruption of conservative cheerleading media in this country that we're in a situation where a Labour minister who was not found to have broken the ministerial code has resigned, and client journalists and various shills who stayed silent about a succession of Tory ministers found to have broken rules and laws and ministerial codes not resigning are somehow trying to make hay out of it. So two things can be true at the same time. Tulip Siddiq should never have been given that job. For relatively obvious reasons. Keir Starmer's, quotes, loyalty, end quotes, looks very double-edged when you consider the speed with which Louise Haigh was shown the door. But the fact that she could refer herself to an ethics advisor and the fact that she's resigned despite not having been found to have broken the ministerial code signals an incredibly different state of affairs from the one that we endured under Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and to a much lesser extent, I think, Rishi Sunak. But obviously, if I'd been shilling for Boris Johnson, if I told you Brexit was a brilliant idea, if I'd been tickling Liz Truss's toes, if I'd been in favour of austerity, if I'd stayed silent while all of these catastrophes unfolded because I'd played a crucial role media-wise in putting all these disasters in place, I'd probably be pretending today that the Tulip Siddiq story was of much more significance or even worthy of comparison with just some of the stories that I have shared with you. Absolutely no other popular media outlet has mentioned the fact that Starmer introduced the independent standards, enhanced the independent standards advisor in this way, nor any of the previous government's law breaking. I've checked most of them. There seems to be a collective amnesia, writes Lorraine, around the misdemeanours of the previous governments. Should we play a misinformation sting at this point? I think that qualifies as a misinformation departure, doesn't it? So there it is. Those are the facts that you need. Oh, I've forgotten another one. Do you remember Lord Geit? He was asked by the Prime Minister to consider a matter that risked deliberate breach of the ministerial code. He later described Boris Johnson placing him in an impossible and odious position by asking him to risk a deliberate and purposeful breach of the ministerial code. This is letters from the advisor. Johnson revealed in his reply that he'd asked Christopher Geit to consider plans by the government to continue some steel tariffs, but hinted that he was unsatisfied with the explanation. Geit had a whole heap of reasons to resign. It's easy to forget the one that actually broke the camel's back. He became the second ethics advisor to Boris Johnson to resign in frustration at Boris Johnson's contempt for ethics. And Keir Starmer literally enhances the role of the ethics advisor and gets castigated by profoundly dishonest media figures, mostly at the Daily Mail, but not exclusively, and the Daily Telegraph, of course. Boris Johnson, who they gave a job to, they literally give him £500,000 a year to write a column, didn't just behave in an entirely opposite fashion. He rode roughshod over ethics to a degree that two independent advisors, whose role Keir Starmer has beefed up, two independent advisors resigned in frustration and disgust at his contempt for ethics. Guy, you'll remember, said that he had initially asked the Prime Minister to justify his position openly, but came to the conclusion that his role was untenable. The idea that a Prime Minister might to any degree be in the business of deliberately breaching his own code is an affront. A deliberate breach or even an intention to do so would be to suspend the provisions of the code to suit a political end. But you can either hire the guy or tickle his toes when he's got a book to promote and then pretend that what's happened to Tulip Siddiq and the Labour Party is scandalous and in any way comparable, or you can be honest. It's a straight choice.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 17 minutes after 11. Thank you for the kind words. Do not worry. We will continue to provide illumination, evidence and facts where so much of the media is dedicated to whatever the polar opposites of those three phenomena may be. But we turn our attention. If I told you that I hated the last topic, I love the next one, and it's really odd because the next one should be the one that makes everybody feel uncomfortable. I think it was partly because of the experiences I had when I lost my father that I found the first time I asked you this question so utterly uplifting. It took away some of the miasma of gloom and misery that accompanies the memory of his death, not the memory of his life, of course. That's a wonderful thing. And it's great if you are currently grieving or in any way close to that kind of place. I promise you will move away from loving the life. You might move away from hating the death to loving the life. You'll always have sadness in your soul when you think of the people that you love. I don't know why I'm telling you all this. I guess because it's the first time I really lost someone. Relatively unexpectedly, and that shock, that trauma, sits with you forever. But I promise you, some of the warmth and positivity returns, and it returned for me in spectacular fashion when we looked at a story about 10 years ago about what I'm afraid can only be described as the cost of dying. And the question I'm going to ask you, if you want to get in early, is whether or not you've haggled at the undertakers. What's your reaction to that question straight off the bat, if you've not heard me ask it before? Go on, tell me. Have you ever haggled at the undertakers? Because I think you do this. I think you go, what? No! Oh, well, why not? Whoa! Especially if you've been involved in organising a funeral for a loved one. And you sat there and you've heard an undertaker say something like, and of course the thingamy-whatsits, they're £5,000 each. And you go, oh yes, I'd like the best thingamy-whatsits, please, the very best, because I love my dad. And if I don't buy the very best thingamy-whatsits for £5,000 each, then I would feel that I was somehow betraying his memory and insulting his life. And the reason I do this is public service. I don't know whether I'm going to end up on a notice board in all the undertakers of Britain as public enemy number one, because why wouldn't you ask more questions when you're in the undertakers? Why wouldn't you say, really? For a box? Really? And it's particularly acute now. There's nothing funny about this. The average cost of dying, that's everything. Funeral, fees that you might pay to lawyers and the like, and a party afterwards, a wake. You're not going to get much change now out of £10,000. That's the average. Remember, we talked about generalising earlier, because you can't. I'm not saying that all funerals cost £10,000. I'm just saying that if you take all funerals, add up the cost of all of them, and then divide it by the number of funerals, you're coming out pretty close to £10,000. And it has never been higher. So the news angle that one newspaper takes today is crowdfunding. The research has been done by an insurance company. Sun Life has been monitoring UK funeral costs for 20 years now. And they point out that the cost of a simple funeral has risen 134% in 21 years. So if you buried or cremated someone in 2004, it would have cost you £1,835. Normal things, the rest of the consumer price inflation, stands at about 75%. So it's not far off double an increase in the cost of a funeral compared to everything else that has also gone up in cost. So Listen, I've got no beef with undertakers, although there was a brilliant, I think it was a Panorama or a Dispatches a few years ago that showed how many of them had been bought up by a big American conglomerate. And even though the sign on your high street might say O'Brien and Sons or Keith and Daughters, the actual company, they were all owned by the same massive American conglomerate, which is why there would be a case for worrying, perhaps, that prices there'd been cooperation on price. You understand what I'm saying? I can't remember the full details of the documentary, but here is the question: Have you tried it? Because it doesn't sit comfortably at first glance, and the reason I come back to this story every 3 or 4 years, probably every time Sun Life publishes the latest data, actually, is because I think we should. I think we should do it more. You're buying a car. I don't know if you'd say discount for cash in an undertaker's, would you? Or is there VAT on funerals? I don't even know. But you wouldn't take it all as read in any other circumstances, I don't think. Some of us are very bad at haggling. I've got a godson, would you believe, who's absolutely brilliant at haggling. Have I told you about this? He's only about 14. I think he was 12 when we had this. I picked him up. I did a school trip at London Zoo. He wanted to go into Camden and spend some of his birthday money on some clothes. I'm frightened of haggling. I was 50 at the time. This lad marches up to the stall holders and starts laying down the law, telling them this, telling them that, walking away, going up the road, talking to someone else, coming back again, comparing. It was absolutely magnificent. It was like being in the souk in Marrakesh. He was a master stroke at it. It'd be a little bit odd to ask him to negotiate my funeral costs when the time comes, but I'll tell you what, he'd save Mrs. O'Brien, please God she's still around, an absolute fortune. So it really jars with us, doesn't it? It really jars with us, the idea that you would sit there. And I think the reason why it jars is because if you feel that you're doing anything remotely cheap, and sometimes haggling can feel a bit cheap, then it feels like you are denigrating the memory of your loved one. But how many loved ones would sit there, were they able to, and say, I'd really like you to pay over the odds for my funeral. I'd really like you to spend money you can't really afford on my funeral son or on my funeral granddaughter. None of them would they? They'd all want you to don't go to, well, maybe not everybody. Some people might like a really big fuss, whether you can afford it or not, but they're not going to be there to see it. And who's going to tell them? So you could quite easily conceive of circumstances in which people are spending money that they can't afford to spend because they haven't got the, what would the word be? They're reluctant to feel bad about the memory of their loved one. Right, hit the numbers now. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. I will take stories today of people who have managed to conduct funerals for a relative pittance, for a tiny amount of money, in the spirit of advice and also in the spirit of explaining and reassuring people that this doesn't involve in any way cheapening the memory of the loved one. But I also want stories of haggling. So there's two ways into this. You paid a fraction of the average cost for your funeral and you have no regrets at all. 0345 6060 973. And you did actually haggle in the under, or your mum did, or someone haggle. I just think that it's almost like a Tony Hancock sketch, isn't it? That idea that you get given the lowdown, you get given the chapter and verse, and you sort of think to yourself, can't you do a bit better on that? Can you? I just find it so incongruous. And yet the more you think about it, the more obvious it should be. Here you go. Joe's been in touch. He says, I'm a funeral director. I totally agree that people should ask questions. I generally talk about this in life before the death occurs. That's what I would prefer. However, I had a customer that haggled everything for his dad's funeral, and because my prices are not overinflated corporate rip-offs, James, I actually ended up burying him at a loss. Well, you're a bad negotiator, Joe, but I'm fairly confident you could absorb the loss because so few people would have come into the undertakers absolutely adamant that they weren't going to pay whatever prices you have in your catalogue. Let's start with Natalie, who's in Taunton. Natalie, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello. Yeah, I've been through this a couple of times with my parents who both died in the last 10 years.
I'm sorry.
And no, it's fine. It's a while ago now. But when my mother died, we were very determined to not fall into this trap. And my brother did a load of research online and discovered that most of it you don't need. So essentially, if you're lucky enough for your parents to die in hospital, and you also don't have any very strong religious views, I appreciate that makes everything very different, the body's in the mortuary. So there's a document that the morticians have. So when you go to pick up the body in a coffin that you can buy online, you can give them some money to put the body in that coffin. Then you need a van. And you can hire a van for a day, or you might have a van in the family. We had a van in the family.
What did it have anything written on the side of it?
No.
Okay, I'm just wondering.
Just a van.
It would have been.
No, just a van.
I don't know, a better story if it had like London, Paris, and Peckham written on the side of Trotters Independent
nothing
Trading.
like that. Nothing like that.
Go on.
So you put the coffin.
Where do you buy the coffin from an undertaker's who would normally provide the full service?
You can buy them online. Just Google it.
Really?
I live on the Somerset Levels. There's a place where you can buy willow coffins that are made locally just up the road.
So that's what you did, and you put it in the family member's van.
Yeah.
Drove it to the hospital. Do they take the coffin? No, carry on.
No, sorry. You drive the van to the hospital, and the morticians put the body in the coffin and in your van. You slip them a tenner or whatever. Yeah. Then you need a plot on a natural burial site. Yeah. They are everywhere nowadays.
Right.
Both my parents are in the same plot on Exmoor, and you drive up to that said burial site with the document in your van, and you go through your own ceremony. You can do what you like. You can make it religious if you wish or not. You can carry the coffin yourselves. You don't need a bunch of strangers to carry the coffin.
But you need. This is an officially licensed site, so there's someone present. There's someone present from the site.
No, not noticeably. She was nowhere near it.
Forgive me for being crass, but I think we've established that there's a sort of weird, morbid comedy to some of these conversations. Yeah. Who dug the hole?
So the site.
So they dig the hole
for you.
Right.
They dig the hole. Yeah.
So all you're paying for the van, for the wicker coffin, willow coffin, a couple of quid for the morticians, and then the fellow who digs the hole, or indeed the lady who digs the hole, and a fee for the site, for the natural burial site.
Yeah.
Okay.
And once you've paid that fee, you don't pay any more. It's not like a stipend or anything like that. Yeah, it's not like that. And we did double dip. When my mother died, we had...
I like that.
It was deep
you put two coffins in the same hole.
Two coffins in the same hole. And you go up there, and it's beautiful, and there's trees and bushes, and everyone's planted whatever they want to do on their family's site. And the most expensive part of the whole thing was the coffin, which was 400 quid.
Go on
Everything
then.
else,
how much all in?
Peanuts.
How much?
Oh, God. 600-700 quid.
All in?
Top.
All done. And then a few quid behind the bar at a local hostelry or something.
You want.
Yeah.
If you want or not. I mean, we did with my mum, we had a little thing up there on the field, and then we had a party a couple of weeks later. And with my dad, we had a little thing up on the field, and then we did actually go to a church and do a little bit of a thing, but only because the church was the only space that we could use. It wasn't as a religious thing. Did you, forgive me, did you, not do you, did you? That's okay.
Talk to did they know what their send-off was going to be?
Well, not directly, but my mother's sister is 3 plots down.
But your mum, your dad went first, I think.
No, my mum went first.
Your mum went first, so your dad knew, roughly. Your dad knew he was going to get the same...
Oh, yes.
And he was happy about that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It was his idea to have the double dip.
Right. And how? I mean, I don't want to be insensitive, but how would your mum have felt about it? Because people quite like people. Would she not? Because people like to, some people leave quite detailed instructions on what songs they want. And
I know, none of that. As far as she's concerned, and I share the same. You're dead. You're not there. It doesn't matter. It's for what everybody else.
And here's £10,000 that we can't really afford for something that nobody really wants.
Exactly.
Gosh.
Exactly.
Right, this is a great first call. Thank you, Natalie.
You're welcome.
I mean, seriously, it'd be hard to improve on. But, of course, we haven't had any hagglers yet. We've just had the first really good advice on alternative. Because you don't even think about alternative. You're in such a daze the first time it happens. You're in such a daze. Someone had said to me, oh, by the way, you have to walk behind the coffin in a Fila shell suit and bright red trainers from 1988 while singing the Marseillaise. I'd have gone, oh, really? Okay, that's fine, yeah. How much? Tom knows what I'm talking about. He says, hi, James. I'm now a cabinet maker. 10 or so years ago, when I was a kid, I had to carry my nan's coffin. Funeral directors said to me, whatever you do, don't lift it by the handles. They were plastic. The coffin was chipboard. The veneer was fake. I know all this because of what I do for a living now. And apparently brass handles were actually made of plastic. They charged my dad £2,500 for it. 10 years later, I think I could make the same thing for 400 quid. It's obscene profiteering. Dominic Ellis is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:35. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I wouldn't wade into this without thinking about it. Part of the reason why I could be confident that the conversations we'd have would somehow manage to walk the tightrope between poignancy and heartbreak, and also humanity and even humour, is because we've done it before, and because I've had the enormous privilege of being able to talk to you every day for a very long time now. My judgment isn't perfect. I'll get things wrong sometimes, but I knew this one would go. I was confident, you never know for sure, that this one would go in the way that it has gone, is going, because of the fact that we've had similar conversations in the past. But let me read you a few texts that show you the absolute gamut of human experience. I talk about those two extremes of heartbreak and humour, and somehow you've managed to walk from one to the other and back again in the course of a few messages into the studio. We'll start with Steve, who's in Guildford. Not often I agree with you. Why'd you have to say that, Steve? Anyway, but we haggled over Mum's funeral and saved £1,800. I'm online now getting a plan for my own. I want to save my daughter the drama that we had, because I know how distressing it can be, reducing the funeral of a loved one to a haggle. Gary in Ayrshire says, I've just had this conversation with my old man. I asked him what funeral arrangements he would like, and he said, surprise me. And of course, got the serious end of it as well, very much so. When my brother died in 2006, Phil tells me, from Germany, his children didn't haggle as such, but they told the undertaker right at the start that there wasn't a lot of money. He was very understanding, offered his cheapest option without any fuss. I think it cost them about £800. That's nearly 20 years ago. Setting expectation from the onset can avoid embarrassment and understanding. This one is particularly poignant from Maggie. When my daughter died recently, I was horrified to have the funeral director at a high street chain try to sell me a, quote, package, including an, quote, economy version, which was definitely not cheap. Apparently personalisation was impossible. When we said what we wanted, she said, I've been selling funerals for 20 years. And it was that word selling, James, that did it for me. I wanted something arranged or conducted. Yeah, and you're never more sensitive than in a situation like yours, Maggie. I'm so sorry for your loss. We got up and left at that point and went with an independent outfit that we found online. It still wasn't peanuts, but it was personal and it was lovely. I'm so glad to hear that. Mandy steers us back towards the lighter end of the spectrum. She writes, if my children drove my coffin in a random van, I'd come back and haunt them. So be warned, children of Mandy. Julie's in Hitchin. Julie, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. How are you?
Julie. Very well, Julie. Enjoying this conversation, somewhat unexpectedly.
Yeah, as soon as I heard it, I had to come on. Anyway, so my mum passed away just over 2.5 years ago, and she was in a hospice. And She constantly asked if she could come home. She kept saying to me, please take me home, which I couldn't do. So that was really heartbreaking. Anyway, she passed away, and a tradition that we've had in our family for a long time is to, whoever's passed away, we like to bring them home before the funeral.
Yes. A lot of families do. A lot of cultures do.
Yeah, we've done that.
Quite an Irish thing as well. I've known it in Irish families. But anyway, sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Anyway, taking into account that the Undertaker's was only 10 minutes down the road, we we told them that we would like Mum brought home at least 2 days before the funeral.
Oh.
So they said that's absolutely fine. It's not a problem. It'll be about £620 odd.
Crikey!
So I just couldn't believe it. No. So I said,
just for the transport, just for the transportation,
literally to bring her 10 minutes down the road to the house.
That's a really good example of something that just feels wrong.
I know. Anyway, so they then said, well, we could bring her home the night before the funeral, and that'll only be about £400 odd.
Right.
So again, I just couldn't believe it.
This is on top of what you would have paid if they picked her up from the hospice.
This is literally because we wanted to bring her
just
home.
this extra stop,
from
as it
the
were.
undertaker.
Yeah. Okay.
To stay at home a couple of nights before the funeral.
I understand.
So I was getting quite annoyed at this point, and I said to them, "Look, what are you going to do if I just come and take her?" And they said to me, "She is your property, and you can do whatever you like."
Good grief.
So with that, my husband and son-in-law hired a van, and they went and picked her up themselves, put her in the back of the van, and brought her home.
Oh.
For £100. I think it cost £100
to hire the van.
Yeah.
And they just she's in a coffin. You pick the coffin up and you bring it home in the van. It's such a great. I love that. Well done. I hope that's not an inappropriate thing to say. Well done. What would she have thought of this story, Julie?
So first of all, she would have been over the moon because obviously she got to come home.
Yes.
And secondly, the fact that my husband and son-in-law picked her up in a van, she would have found that hilarious.
I hoped you were going to say that. I was fairly confident you would.
Yeah.
Because it's objectively. What's it got Avis stuck on the side of it or something like that?
Well, do you know what? They did do it pretty decently. They hired a black van.
Oh, that's nice.
So,
that was put a little bit of, cost a little bit more, but gave it that sort of air of officialdom, which...
No, she would have laughed.
Oh, that is funny. And good for you as well to know that her sort of wishes had been met, had been kept.
Yeah.
And then the undertaker picked her up from home on the day of the funeral.
Yes, so on the day of the funeral, that's correct, yeah.
Just briefly, that little moment where you thought, I don't have to do... Because I don't think most of us have that. Most of us just think, oh, well, they're in charge. You know, this is the people that do it every day. We do it, once or twice a decade maximum. What do you think went on in your mind? Why do you think you made that decision to challenge what you were being told?
Well, I hadn't really dealt with a lot of funerals before.
No.
I'd helped my mum with my dad.
Right.
In actual fact, for lots of different reasons, we didn't bring my dad home. That was a different scenario. Sure. And I was just getting really annoyed to think, do you know what? This is 10 minutes down the road.
Yeah. That can't be right. That's it. If it had been 2 hours away, you probably would have thought, oh, fair enough. It's 4 hours out of their day, but it's 10 minutes down the road. You could do it in your lunch hour.
I couldn't see how they could justify that sort of money.
Oh, that's lovely. I love that story. Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome.
No, that's perfect. Dash is in Bromley. Dash, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi there. I think my story kind of chimes in a little bit with the first call.
We're not getting any hagglers. We're getting sort of DIYers, aren't we? It's gone in a slightly different direction. I'm enjoying it.
When I was explaining it to your researcher, she sort of asked me to cut to the chase of my point. So
she does that to me She does that to me all the time, Dash. Don't feel bad about it. So let's cut to the chase.
Then you can decide if you want more questions. So we buried my mum in the garden.
Okay, I definitely have a few questions. Is that what she wanted? Did she die of natural causes? Did she die of natural causes? That's the most important question to ask, isn't it?
No, my mum was 97, yes, and died of natural causes, and was not religious at all. We're very fortunate that where we live, we're sort of on the edge of the green belt, basically. So whilst it's a garden and not farmland, it does, it's in that kind of open area. And my brother found out that so long as you fit certain criteria, you have a right to, bury someone in the garden. You can bury them where you like.
You can apply to the council for permission, I think.
Yes. Yeah. So, so long as you're not near waterways or other houses and things like that, they can't really stop you from doing it. So originally my mum had wanted to be left to medical science, but she was kind of so old and kind of thin and small by the time she died that they didn't want her. So we thought, okay, what do we do? So we found out about being able to bury her in the garden. We're friends with a local farmer. He came along with his digger and dug a big hole. We got the, similar to one of your other messages, it was sort of the cheapest chipboard coffin. they brought her, the mortuary brought her to the house. It was just myself and my siblings, because at 97 there was not really any friends of my mum left. And they were sort of slightly surprised at what was going on. And we took her out the back of the hearse and put her in the back of my sister's estate car. Drove her down to the spot in the garden, and then me and my siblings kind of lowered her down into the ground and got the local farmer back to fill it in. I
think that's the most why of all the DIY versions that we've heard. I think the estate car pushes you over into first. Was that a Volvo by any chance?
No, I don't think it was, actually.
And had you talked to your mum about it at all? I mean, you mentioned medical science. Your mum didn't have any desire for a grand send-off or anything like that, not least because, as you've said, there wouldn't have been any of her contemporaries there to witness it.
No, and she was, I think it's difficult because I want to be sensitive to other people's feelings.
Exactly
that. Mum was very much, when you're dead sort of thing.
Yes.
So hence the medical science, if she could do something of use, then why not? So she was quite irreverent about these sort of things.
Yeah, so she'd have loved it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Very much so. And then, we sat around. My brother one of my brothers at that time was in Australia. So we kind of video streamed it for him to see, said a few speeches and, had a couple of drinks and said cheers. It was nice. Delightful.
That does sound delightful. What a lovely word to use for saying goodbye to your mum. And roughly, I hesitate to ask because it seems a bit mercenary. What do you reckon? How much do you reckon it set you back all in?
Do you know what? I'm not entirely sure because my brother did the organising of the actual coffin.
Yes.
The digging of the hole was our friend, the local farmer, so that didn't cost anything.
Did you chip in for petrol, or did your sister have to pick up the bill on her own?
I didn't even think of that. No, I think my sister had to pay all the petrol to drive her down the path.
All 200 yards.
Of the garden.
All 200 yards of it. Dash, thank you. And as Alex has said, and your call is possibly the best example of what he describes, and he sent it before you came on. This has to be one of the best hours of radio I've ever heard. Sad, enlightening and hilarious in equal measures. Thank you. Well, I couldn't do it without Dash and everybody else. It's 11:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10 to 12 is the time. I wouldn't want, nobody does as far as I can tell, but I wouldn't want anybody to think that we are in any way denigrating the desire to give a loved one an amazing send-off. It can be to the benefit of the people saying goodbye to an immeasurable degree. But everybody is different. Tricia makes a brilliant point. She says, when my younger brother died, we paid top money for everything. My mum wanted to do it because it was the last thing she could ever do for her baby. I can see why it would be different, for example, with elderly parents. So I'm not for a moment suggesting that there's anything wrong or silly or suspect about wanting the full Monty. The horses, you see the horses sometimes going. So I live near a care home, so we see probably a little bit more than the average number of funerals that you'd expect to see, and sometimes the full kit and caboodle turn up with the horses, with the plumed headdresses or whatever they're called, and that's beautiful. And you're going, but everybody's different, which is why the question I've asked most, I think, this hour is what would they have thought about whatever it is that you did. It's 11:51. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A few people wondering what happens if you bury a loved one in the garden. I sensed from Dash's conversation that it was a farm, it was farmland, and therefore it will be being handed down through the generations. And I found myself wondering, as Gary did as well and a couple of others, is it the best call we've ever taken on the programme, the funniest call we've ever taken on the programme, from the lad who it's a saga of a story, but he wanted to scatter his dead cat's ashes at sea, or rather his wife wanted to scatter their dead cat's ashes at sea. Was that that wasn't prompted by a conversation about funerals, was it? I think that was prompted by a conversation about spending inordinate amounts of money on pets. We should do that again soon as well. That's a pretty good fun. They all come round again, don't they, in the end? Stick around for long enough, everything comes back into fashion. But this began, of course, as a discussion about haggling at the undertakers because it feels so almost counterintuitive and or wrong, and I don't think that it should. Jay is in Eastbourne. Jay, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi, good morning to you.
Hello, Jay.
my little sister, she had a stalking disease called Huntington's disease, and about 3 months before she passed away, I had this overwhelming desire to get me ducks in a row and sort out the funeral arrangements.
Okay, so you knew it was coming.
Yeah, it was coming. I knew it was coming.
Yeah.
So I phoned up the undertakers and I said, "Hello, mate. Regarding my sister," he went, "Oh, you poor chap." He said, "She's passed away." I went, "No, she hasn't passed away yet."
Right.
And I was in an open plan office and everyone was earwigging. I should have really gone to a quiet room.
Yeah.
But they're all wigging. So anyway, I had a chinwag with this fella and I wound up getting it reduced by 700 quid because I said to him, "Look, I've never met a poor undertaker yet.
No,
and
it's a fair
there's a bit
point.
of a recession going on. How about we have a deal?" And of course, the whole office, I became conscious of the whole office was all zoning in on this call. Anyway, I wound up having a chat, got the 700 quid knocked off the deal.
700 Spondulics.
Yeah, 700 spons knocked up, and I put that 7 behind the bar for the bit of a drink up for my sister and everything.
Nice
But
tuck. Go on.
At the end of the phone call, the whole office, they was a bit snooty. It was like they wanted to throw rotten tomatoes at me.
Yeah. I mean, what business were you in at the time, Jay?
Oh, you won't a lot. I was working in Teddington in the National Physical Laboratory up there.
Oh, okay.
So it was a bit of a civil servicey type place.
So it wasn't sales then. It wasn't like, because there should have been. If you were working in sales, they'd have been impressed, wouldn't they?
Well,
you hang up on the undertaker and then flog someone some double glazing.
Yeah, exactly. But that's how it was. It saved me 700 quid, and it went behind the bar for Christina's funeral.
Oh, and so that's what she would have liked.
Absolutely, sir. Yes.
How much did it cost you all in all, even with the discount? Can you remember?
There's about 3.8 in the end.
Yeah, it's not cheap, is it? It's not cheap. So that was a significant discount, and it sounds as if the undertaker was happy to give it to you as well. A little bit of the human connection, almost everywhere.
Yeah.
You go in high if you're selling, don't you? If you're the one that's selling, you go in high. Almost everywhere, in almost all circumstances, you expect a little bit of give and take. I mean, what was I telling you about the other day? I found that magnificent little watch shop in the bottom of the Grays Antique Centre just off Bond Street. I sent a picture of one of the watches to my mate James, who loves watches, and he said that one in the top left is overpriced. And I said, I'm sure you can negotiate. And he said, offer them 5. I said, I'm not in the market for a vintage Rolex, James, and it's highly unlikely that I ever will be, but I imagine that when you're pricing stuff up in that kind of context, particularly at antiques fairs or boot sales, you're not expecting anyone to pay the original price. You're delighted, sometimes even a bit embarrassed when they do. But something about an undertaker's that makes us all deeply, deeply, deeply reluctant to question the original price. The one that's going to stay with me on this one is the cabinet maker. I've lost it now. I always do lose my favourite messages because I read them out and then I wave them goodbye. But the cabinet maker who knows now that what he buried I think it was his dad in, was worth less than about 10% of what they actually paid for it, because he knows what it would cost him to make it today. 11:56 is the time. PMQs on the way. Whether or not that continues the theme of humour or morbidity, only time will tell. But I think we can squeeze in one more. Chris, who is in Chiswick. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. I'm another DIYer, I'm afraid.
No, I love I think I prefer the DIYers to the hagglers. They're more unexpected, aren't they? The hagglers all have the same story in a way. The DIYers are all different. But carry on anyway.
Well, after my mother died, I went to the undertakers, and they gave me their spiel, and I just began to get the creeps, and I thought, I'm not handing my mother over to these people. They're strangers. She never knew them. Yeah. I can do this myself, and I have there's a background to this, because my great-grandfather, who, because of failing eyesight, lost his job as a locksmith and was faced with either the workhouse or self-employment, set himself up as an undertaker. And the first, there's a family story about it, the first funeral he did was for his next-door neighbour's child, who died. It happened a lot in the mid-19th century. And he made more money on that one job than he made in a week working as a locksmith.
Well, there it is.
So I thought I can do this myself, and I got so much help from the mortician at the hospital, from the lady at the crematorium, Mortlake Crematorium, and from a charity called the Natural Death Centre, who basically held my hand all the way through. And
do they exist to help people in your position?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And they told me exactly what I needed to do, and it ended up I got a double slot at Mortlake Crematorium for 375 quid. This is 7 years ago. It might be a bit more now. I got a hearse with a driver, which came from a company which actually provides overflow capacity for undertakers.
Okay.
If they've got too many funerals on the same day.
I understand,
So
yes. You really did your research, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. Well, with Health and Natural Death Centre.
Yes, no, well done for mentioning them, because other people may be able to go to them. You're going to make me late for PMQ, so
Okay.
what do we think we paid all in?
1,400 quid. The coffin I got online for 200 quid.
I've just found a website.
The undertaker offered me for 1,500.
That's not bad, is it? I've just found a website called comparethecoffin.com.
Okay.
I'm not even joking, Chris.
Okay. Well, it was 15% of the price, 85% cheaper, roughly.
That's incredible.
But 1,400 quid, under 1,500 quid for the whole shebang at the funeral, including a tip to the priest who didn't want to take any money.
Oh, that's nice.
But we then blew 2,000 quid at my mother's favourite pub.
Well, that's not waste. Was that in Chiswick by any chance?
At Kew Green, the Greyhound.
Oh, beautiful pub. Money well spent, Chris. Money well spent. I got married literally next door. Thank you. And of course, more important than the savings was the fact that you felt deeply and personally involved in all of the arrangements, which, when you put it like that, is makes perfect sense. Natasha Clark is here, not to talk about funerals. Maybe a political funeral in the case of Tulip Sadiq.
But that was a nice segue.
But that was, yes, I've done this before. That was yesterday. What are we expecting to come out today? First of all, it is Badenoch and Starmer. It is the leaders. It is the A team.
Yeah, that's right. The A
so
team today. And yes, maybe we might have a bit of a funeral atmosphere today with Tulip Sadiq. Obviously, it's just the day after Keir Starmer was forced to get rid of his Treasury Minister after Sir Laurie Magnus essentially found that he cleared her of breaking the ministerial code and any wrongdoing, but was quite critical of her conduct and how she'd acted. And
as if he hadn't been given as much information as he might have wanted.
That's absolutely right. Yep, he is saying that it was really difficult for him to go through all the records. He had to take her at face value because he didn't quite get all the information that he needed to make a decision about how she had acted and whether there were any links to her aunt's Bangladeshi regime in terms of finances and houses and all this nonsense that we've sort of been hearing about. I think it would be obviously quite the obvious goal for Kemi Bade not to go for that one today.
Tricky though with the recent events in the Conservative benches.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, the juxtaposition between ministers who broke the code and didn't resign.
It's true.
Versus ministers who didn't break the code but did resign would be easy to make. Although Starmer doesn't tend to go to places like that as quickly as some might hope.
Yeah, and it's been 6 months, obviously, of Keir Starmer's government. We've lost 2 ministers, but look at every other Tory Prime Minister. They lost far more in the first 6 months of their office than Keir Starmer has. So, it depends whether Kemi Badenoch senses that weakness. Equally, it's been a pretty tough week for the Treasury generally. The economy, you've had those inflation figures today still piling pressure on, even though they are down a bit. Rachel Reeves yesterday putting up pretty strong performance in the Commons in the face of quite a lot of pressure and quite a lot of grumbling, I think, from her backbenchers about how she is handling the economic situation. And of course, those
Although
gilt
she handled
markets.
Mel Stride pretty well.
Yeah, no, I think she did really well yesterday in the Commons, despite some sniping from the sidelines from Mr. Stride. But yes, I think there is still quite a lot of pressure on. She's not out of the woods yet, so I think Kemi Badenoch might sense a little bit of weakness on the economy and go in on that.
Well, briefly, and of course we'll cross as soon as she gets to her feet. I read last week, because it was a debacle last week, she did all 6 questions on grooming gangs, which was essentially just bending the knee for Elon Musk and leaving all facts and most evidence at the door. I read somewhere that she will think that went well, even as everybody else was convinced it was one of the worst PMQs they'd ever seen from a leader of the opposition.
Well, as we discussed last week, there was a definite shift in the Prime Minister's language on grooming gangs. We've seen more Labour MPs come out in the past few days calling for a national inquiry. The mood seems to have softened a little bit. The number 10 line has definitely changed. They definitely have left the door open. Kemi Badenoch, whether it's her pressure or others, we'll see that as a win for her, that she's managed to help put that pressure on. And again, she'll be saying, I was calling for Tulip Sadiq to go at the weekend, and it's taken him however many days for her to step down. So again, she'll be able to claim these as wins, whether they are her fault or not.
And of course, their polling.
That's politics.
Their polling is in the toilet.
Tories
this week.
as well, yeah.
I meant the Tories. Labour are still ahead in most polls, albeit by a fraction of the margin that they had when they won the election, but the Tories are fading fast.
Yeah, we've now got a three-party state, according to some of those polls that we've been seeing from
How very
Labour
European.
Reform. I know, exactly.
We leave the EU and end up with an electoral system that looks...
Well, the Lib Dems aren't
just like
a little further behind.
Well, we're not seeing a forecast of what this would mean in terms of seats before everybody gets too excited.
Big poll.
You probably still find the Lib Dems do rather well when it comes to a seat distribution. As I say, we will cross live. Any left field suggestions, Natasha? Anything that might come up that
wild card
we are not expecting? Yes,
Cherry Adams. The Northern Ireland legacy story today, that because of repealing the Northern Ireland Legacy Act, which is incredibly unpopular in Northern Ireland, it might mean that Cherry Adams could be in line for a payout. That might be the kind of culture war wedge issue that you might think that someone like Kemi Badenoch might want to ask. But equally, it might be something that a backbencher might want to pipe up with as well.
Do we know why he would qualify for compensation? Is it because he was locked up on mere suspicion of involvement in things? I think
it's just because the legislation will undo all of the High Court decisions and essentially could just open the way to have a payout for sort of some form of compensation deal for his imprisonment. But yes, I confess I'm not across all of the exact detail on that one. But yeah, I think it would be incredibly controversial, of course, and it's already a pretty controversial bit of legislation, one that the Conservatives and Labour fought tooth and nail over during the election campaign, of whether this will mean amnesties for potential terrorists.
Well, in important context, the Supreme Court found that he had been illegally incarcerated.
Yeah, of course, exactly. But again, should he receive a payout? That's a different matter. I think.
I completely agree. But anybody else who was illegally incarcerated would get a payout.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
It's just like Jerry Adams carries a heft, best expressed perhaps by some of the surviving family members of people killed by the IRA. Here is the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday, while borrowing costs hit levels not seen since Labour was last in government, I met business owners and their employees in Chesterfield. One of them told me that his business will not exist in 4 years' time because of this government's policies. It might not even exist next year. The Prime Minister may try to blame his inheritance or blame global factors, but why should anyone trust a word he says over the businesses who are saying again and again that his budget means fewer jobs, lower growth and higher borrowing costs?
Mr. Speaker, as you know, the global economy is experiencing volatility and higher borrowing costs. That is why it was vital that we took the tough and right decisions in the budget to get our finances back in order. We had to deal with the £22 billion black hole that they left. We made difficult cuts, raised taxes to invest in health, public services and housing, vital to stability, vital to growth. And we've got an ironclad commitment to our fiscal rules. And she will welcome, no doubt, the inflation figures from this morning. But contrast that with the party opposite. That's right. They weren't brave enough in government to take those difficult decisions. They've opposed all of our measures to stabilise the economy and promote growth. They're back to the magic money tree. She wants all the benefits of the budget, but she can't say how she's going to pay for them. They haven't changed. They're still economic vandals and fantasists. Imagine where we'd be if they were still in charge.
Mr. Speaker, just today, the British Retail Consortium says 2/3 of businesses will have to raise prices to cope with his tax hike. His Chancellor ignored all the warnings and ploughed ahead with an unprecedented borrowing spree, leaving all of us more vulnerable. Now we have businesses saying they will raise prices to cover his jobs tax. We have an energy policy that will drive up bills, and all the while we are spending more day to day on debt interest than we do on schools and universities. The Prime Minister refused to repeat his Chancellor's promise that she wouldn't come back for more. Will he now rule out any new tax rises this year?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we took the right and difficult decisions at the budget. Decisions that they did not have the courage to take, which left us in the mess in the first place. When it comes to tax, she knows very well the limits of what I can say from this dispatch box, but we have an ironclad commitment to our fiscal rules.
We can't just tax our way out of the problems that they left us, which is why we put in place tough. They were howling at the spending decisions. They wouldn't take them. And we'll stick to those spending decisions. And our focus is absolutely on growth. But their record, they flatlined the economy. They flatlined the economy. A mini budget that crashed the economy. Worst cost of living crisis in living history. And they left a £22 billion black hole. Not taking lessons from them on the economy.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows very well the OBR found no such black hole. And he talks about a budget 3 years ago. The borrowing costs last week are at a 27-year high for 30-year gilts. The Chancellor is apparently promising to be ruthless in reducing spending. Let me suggest something that he should cut. There is no way that we should be giving up British territory in Chagos. He is rushing a deal which will be disastrous and which will land taxpayers with a multi-billion-pound bill. Why does the Prime Minister think British people should pay to surrender something that is already ours?
Mr. Speaker, we inherited a situation where the long-term operation of a vital military base was under threat because of legal challenges. The negotiations were started under the last government. The then Foreign Secretary came to this House to say why he was starting negotiations and what he wanted to achieve. And he said the aim was, to quote, ensure the continued effective operation of the base. That is precisely what this deal has delivered.
Mr. Speaker, there is no one he can blame for this dud deal except himself. At the budget, Labour were congratulating themselves for having the first female Chancellor, instead of ensuring the country had someone actually qualified to do the job. The Prime Minister,
I want to hear... Sorry. I want to hear the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister claims he has full confidence in the Chancellor, but the markets clearly do not. Yesterday, the Chancellor repeated her promise to have just one budget per year to provide businesses with certainty. The talk in the city is that she can't meet her fiscal rules and there will need to be an emergency budget. So does the Prime Minister stand by the Chancellor's commitment that there will be only one budget this year?
Prime Minister.
She'll be pleased to know the Chancellor will be in place for many, many years to come. She'll outstrip them. Mr. Speaker, if we all thought the politics was about cheap points, I could criticise their chancellors, but I don't have enough time to go through all of the chancellors that they had. We have one budget, that's what we're committed to, strong fiscal rules, and we'll stick to them, unlike the party opposite.
Mr. Speaker, at a time of turmoil in the markets, the Prime Minister was distracted by the crisis around the former City Minister. What does it tell us about his judgment that yesterday he said he was saddened that his close friend resigned? This was an anti-corruption minister under criminal investigation for corruption. Mohammed Yunus, the Nobel Prize winner advising Bangladesh, said London properties gifted to the former city minister may be proceeds of robbery. So, will the Prime Minister offer Bangladesh the full support of our National Crime Agency in ensuring that any properties bought with stolen funds are properly investigated?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the former city minister referred herself the independent advisor. He found, as she well knows, there was no breach of the code. He knows that he found there was no wrongdoing, and the former minister fully cooperated. She referred herself a week ago Monday. I got the report yesterday, and she resigned yesterday afternoon. Compare that with the shadow foreign secretary, who breached the ministerial code. Her predecessor, Batu, ignored it, It was the advisor that then had to resign because he wasn't taken seriously. And she's now serving the leader of the opposition. What a contrast. Thank God the British public chucked them out.
Mr. Speaker, he did not answer the question about the National Crime Agency. No answer to investigating dodgy Labour ministers, just as last week he didn't want an inquiry that might expose dodgy Labour councils. The Prime Minister knowingly appointed a convicted fraudster as his Transport Secretary. The anti-corruption minister he had full confidence in only days ago resigned yesterday in disgrace. He is negotiating a secret deal to surrender British territory, and taxpayers in this country will pay for the humiliation. Now it turns out his government may write a cheque to compensate Jerry Adams. This is shameful. We left him the fastest growing economy in the G7. In just 6 months, under his leadership, it's been taxes up, borrowing up, mortgage rates up, and that's not all. Business confidence is down, jobs are down, growth is down. Can the country afford 4 more years of his terrible judgments?
Mr. Speaker, among that barrage of complete nonsense, there is one point that I need to address, because it's the Legacy Act, and it will be of real interest across the House. That Act was unfit because, well, not least because it gave immunity to hundreds of terrorists and wasn't supported by victims in Northern Ireland, nor, I believe, by any of the political parties in Northern Ireland. The court found it unlawful. We will put in place this is a serious point. We will put in place a better framework. We're working on a draft remedial order and replacement legislation, and we will look at every conceivable way to prevent these types of cases claiming damages. And it's important I say that on the record. But as for her claim and her nonsense, they crashed the economy. Mr. Speaker, I got a letter this week from a Tory voter in a Labour seat. I hope they don't mind me saying who it was. It was Liz Truss. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't written in green ink, but it might as well have been. She was complaining that saying she'd crashed the economy was damaging her reputation. It was actually crashing the economy that damaged her reputation. Mr. Speaker, what have we heard? All they've got is complaining. No defence for their sorry record. They don't even acknowledge it. No ideas, no policy. They're like a blank piece of paper, blowing hopelessly in the wind. No wonder the country put them in the bin.
Jim Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Patients in Kent are experiencing a winter crisis resulting from years of underinvestment in our NHS. Many are having to be treated on trolleys in corridors with cases of winter flu and other viruses, providing a significant challenge to local health services. What assurance can the Prime Minister offer my residents in Dartford that the reforms and extra investment set out by the Secretary of State for Health will make this inadequate care a thing of the past, and would he visit Darrant Valley Hospital in Dartford with me?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this, and I'm deeply sorry for those receiving inadequate care in his constituency. The last government left the NHS in a critical condition, and you can't deliver growth with record waiting lists, 2.8 economically inactive. Our plan for change, investing in the NHS, diagnostic centres, and I will, of course, consider his invitation.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I echo the words of the Prime Minister about President Trump, and hope both his team and the team of President-elect Biden can work together to bring President-elect Trump and President Biden can work together to bring the peace in Gaza we so desperately need, so the hostages can be released, we can get the aid in, and the killing can stop. Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Member for Dartford just said, patients are suffering through the worst NHS winter crisis on record. Last month alone, 54,000 people waited more than 12 hours in A&E. Over 63,000 were stuck in ambulances for over an hour before they could even get into hospital. So there's no doubt the flu season has made the winter crisis worse. But we see these winter crises year after years of neglect of the NHS by the Conservatives. NHS leaders say we will never put an end to these winter crises unless we fix the crisis in social care. Now, I asked him this question last week and I was disappointed in his replies. I'm going to try again. Will he scrap the 3-year timetable he's given to the Casey Commission so he can fix social care this year and implement the reforms by the end of this year at the latest?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, on the talks towards a ceasefire, we are encouraged by the talks. I think the whole House would urge all to come to an agreement and have the hostages released. We all understand the absolute torture that their families are going through every single minute, every single day that this continues. So we hope that there can be progress there. In relation to the NHS, he's absolutely right. The party opposite left it on its knees. There's no point groaning. It is absolutely disgraceful that the NHS was left in the state that it was in. Absolutely disgraceful. We are investing to turn that around. We are reforming to turn that around. We are within that reform dealing with social care. I set out the timetable to him last week in the way that he knows it's set out.
Sir Ed Davey.
Speaker, I'm particularly disappointed by the Prime Minister's position on social care, and I'm going to keep coming back to this issue because unless we fix it, we won't fix the NHS. But turning now to the economy, an idea for the Chancellor to grow the economy. As President-elect Trump prepares to take office next week, there are reports that a number of wealthy, high-skilled Americans are looking to come to the UK for fear of what President-elect Trump will do to their country. But because the Conservatives so broke the immigration system, many of them are finding there's no visa that they can apply for. Now, I know the Prime Minister is rightly seeking to reduce immigration from the record highs of the Conservative. But does he agree, if people like this want to come to our country to bring their money and their skills so we can grow our economy and pay for our public services, they should be able to?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we welcome all investment into the United Kingdom, and I'm very pleased we've had record investment in the time that we've been in office and continue to welcome investors and investment to this country. But he's absolutely right. The last government lost control of immigration as they lost control of health and the economy and the borders and everything else. And it was, of course, the Leader of the Opposition who was championing the driving up of the numbers. So we will bring those numbers down. We'll get it back under control. We'll encourage investment.
Christine Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dental deserts mean
20 minutes after 12 is the time. We will return with Natasha Clark and a little analysis of what you've just heard after these words.
James O'Brien on LBC.
23 minutes after 12 is the time. Absolute skip fire from Badenoch. Incoherent conflation of different questions. Utterly nonsensical. She's getting worse every week, says Ian. If I have to hear Starmer talking about the party opposite one more time rather than actually outlining what he is doing as PM, I'm going to scream, and I voted for him. With respect, it's PMQs, so he can only answer the questions that the party opposite has asked, and if that involves comparisons with the party opposite, then it'd be daft not to. Hilarious that Truss sent a letter whining about her reputation. Stop reminding people that I broke the country. Nobody is approaching me for lobbying opportunities, is Cameron's analysis of the situation. The second part of that text being in quotes, imagining what is going on in Liz Truss's mind, which is probably quite a dangerous thing to do in any circumstances. Oh dear, Badenoch is really awful. Genuine question. She's been leader of the opposition for a while now. Has she ever actually done well at one of these? I mean, like properly done well. It's a good question, that, from Mike in Sutton, because I think 2 weeks ago we said she'd done better than before. But that's not the same as as Mike puts it, like properly done well.
What do you define as being done well at Prime Minister's questions?
When you've left someone reeling.
You know when you've left someone with a slight bloody nose because they're on the back foot, they're, slightly sort of confused by the questions that you're throwing at them, or they don't have an answer to what you're saying, or they look a bit rattled, or you've got all the MPs on the opposite side cheering. Is that a win? Or you've extracted some form of concession out of them that they've admitted that something the government is doing is not great. So there's potential for that. Has she done any of that yet? I'd argue no. I'd argue no. But is she getting better? Actually, no. I thought her tone of her calmer tone, when she gets less angry and she gets less animated, I think it makes her look as a more serious politician. I think she's much better at doing
She can't win. Tom's been listening very closely for the last few weeks. He says Badenoch's new, more measured approach to delivering her questions has reached the point where even she sounds bored of her own voice.
Well, that's it, right? So do you want her to be shouty and really annoying and everyone hates you, or do you want to be boring?
Who'd be a politician?
Well, people used to say that about Keir Starmer, didn't they? How boring he is. But, maybe the British public wants some boring at the moment. But look, an interesting sort of tactic from her today, more of a sort of scattergun approach of topics rather than just going in on one thing. I think we had several questions last week about grooming gangs, didn't we? She really went on one topic and really drilled into the detail, and that's one way of doing it. But today we went from the economy, Che Goss, grooming gangs, bit of Tulip Sadiq, bit of Adams, bit of Sherry Adams, bit back to the economy again. Sometimes that doesn't work as a tactic to thread them all through. But I think the issue of the economy, which she started and she came to end on, I think is going to be a strong one for her to be able to keep batting the government with. And even if she doesn't land a killer blow, she'll feel, I think, happy that she's able to chip off just a little bit of confidence, even Keir Starmer, even if there is no one knockout.
Yeah, and some of these issues will not be going away. Some of them Keir Starmer will be hoping will be going away. He could do without any more personnel issues, couldn't he? In the near future. It's a funny one. I'd forgotten. I think they listen now and pick up some key points that they certainly used to. I ran through all of the Tories who didn't resign, despite having been measurably in much, much more trouble than Tulip Sadiq has found herself in. Not just, of course, the ones that were found to have breached the ministerial code and even prompted ministerial advisors to resign in disgust over Boris Johnson's failure to implement the findings of their own investigations. He lost two in slightly different circumstances, of course, and left office without having put anybody in the role at all.
Exactly.
And Starmer didn't boast about the fact that he's changed the rules to make it even more transparent and allow ministers to refer themselves to the advisor. But when I ran through the list, which has various people on it, Priti Patel being one of them, she had two offences, of course. One when she had secret meetings with a foreign government against the express requirements of her job description, which Theresa May fired her for, and one when an investigation by the ethics advisor Alex Allen found that she'd bullied staff, bullied civil service staff, and Boris
now
Johnson.
she's on the front bench.
Boris Johnson responded by saying we must protect her. Literally, couldn't have a more different response to a scandal. I'd forgotten, however, that she was Shadow Foreign Secretary. So again, Badenoch kind of pulls this blunderbuss out of her arsenal, and Keir Starmer can just spike the gun really easily by saying, look who you're sitting next to. Everything is worse.
Yeah, and
you've made her
that.
Foreign Secretary, Shadow Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, he did that, and he laid out the charges against Priti Patel this afternoon as well, saying Tulip Sadiq didn't breach the ministerial code, she didn't do anything wrong, and she actually resigned. Unlike Priti Patel, who had to be fired.
Does it land? I mean, I know that some of Fleet Street pretends that there are parallels to be drawn, but for the average punter, are they really going to sit there and think this person who's resigned having not broken any rules is just as bad as the person who didn't resign over breaking rules?
Yeah, I think some of it does, some of it doesn't. I don't think that people will be... People have short memories, don't they?
They do.
They don't remember all of the stuff that happened under the Tories and happened under Boris Johnson and other Tory prime ministers. But actually, there is a risk, I think, for Keir Starmer here. And there are people in the Labour Party asking genuine questions about his judgment for appointing his friend in the first place.
Well, that's a very different
problem.
Yeah, and that I think Stephen Bush in the FT in his newsletter this morning absolutely nailed it. You just don't hire someone to be a corruption minister who is adjacent to, before these investigations and allegations landed, but adjacent to a regime that was plagued by various suspicions and allegations.
Yeah, I think it was probably a mistake in hindsight to hire her. And obviously when you become an MP, of course, you have all sorts of security and clearance checks, and there's a lot of background and probing into your links and your family and all this stuff. Like I say, it doesn't feel like it breached any form of rule, but I don't think it's a great look for Keir Starmer because he said he was going to be better than the last guys, and it does damage a little bit of trust. And again, I don't think it's a knockout blow. It's nothing compared to the Tories, but I think it will damage a little bit of trust in the government. People will, I think, maybe rather than being angry at Keir Starmer, just maybe feel a little bit disappointed.
And unhappiness in the party as well over the contrast with how Louise Haigh was treated.
Yeah, exactly. And, Louise Haigh was, cut loose fairly quickly compared to Tulip Siddiq, who has arguably been hanging on for a couple of weeks after these allegations first started coming out. And like I say, Keir Starmer is a close ally of Tulip Siddiq. They are constituency neighbours. They are close. I'm pretty sure one of them called the other one of their good friends best friends in politics, or something similar at one point. So yeah, there are questions there, and there are people in the Labour Party that are unhappy with how the Tulip Siddiq saga has been handled, and equally with Rachel Reeves as well. A pretty strong performance from her yesterday in the Commons. He's looking. She looks pretty confident on the front bench today.
Doesn't she?
Yeah, she looks like she is genuinely in sort of control of things and feeling a bit. I think she came out.
Inflation was good, unexpected good news. I don't think that she can claim the credit for it necessarily, but
no, but she's come out the last 24, 48 hours stronger than she went into them coming out of
That's a good
China.
way of putting it.
And she's not out of the woods. She's got a tricky few months of public finances, lots of speculation about what she's going to do. And interesting, you heard Keir Starmer, Kemi Badenoch tried to get him to rule out tax rises. He wouldn't do that. He said, I don't want to tax my way out of this problem. But that's going to be, I think, a theme for Kemi Badenoch to continue to hit them with for the next couple of months.
Thank goodness she brought up the Chagos Islands. That'll be a big issue to the majority of the British public.
Yeah, exactly. We were going to go, where on earth are they?
Also, Chris asks, I thought the Tories negotiated these deals.
They started it, yeah, they did.
Labour just got it signed.
They did. James Cleverly, as Foreign Secretary, started negotiating this deal.
With the intention of not ending the negotiation with a deal, or with the intention of ending it with a different deal that goes to a different school.
That's their argument. Exactly, right. That's their argument.
Good old James Cleverly.
Different argument goes to different school. They would have had to come to some sort of deal because the lease was at risk of being legal challenged. But hey,
don't ever let the facts stand in the way of a furious rant.
That's an argument for next week when Donald Trump gets back to the White House.
Isn't it just? Thank you, Natasha. 12:32 is the time. We're catching up with events in the Middle East after this with our most trusted source, our most excellent source and advisor, Noga Tarnapolsky. The prospect of a ceasefire moving ever closer, but with some, perhaps predictable problems popping up in Jerusalem. It's 12:32. Tim Humphrey has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:36 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't think anybody would be... I think anybody could be forgiven for hearing news of imminent ceasefires between Israel and Hamas and pausing before celebrating, such as the complication, the detail, and of course the lessons of the past. According to the current draft, fighting will stop in Gaza for 42 days. Dozens of Israeli hostages and hundreds of Palestinian prisoners will be freed. In phase one, Israeli troops will pull back to the edges of Gaza, and many Palestinians will be able to return to, I don't think we can even say what remains of their homes. They'll be able to return to the hellscape where their homes used to be, and the flow of aid will be stepped up. That seems to be close to fruition. The question, of course, remains, will the ceasefire survive beyond that first phase? Noga Tarnapolsky is a freelance journalist based in Jerusalem, to whom the more complicated the situation, the quicker we turn. And she joins me now. Where are we, Noga? What is the latest?
Hi, James. Well, the latest has been so confusing and so rushed that it's hard to say. The latest has been contradictory. On the one hand, we have heard pretty serious reports and from numerous sources of what you just said, which is that basically, at least on the Israeli side, there's no intention of enacting this deal beyond phase one. So it would be 42 days, during which 33 out of 98 Israeli hostages would be released. Israel apparently will not know if those about to be released are alive or dead until they're delivered. and several hundred Palestinian prisoners will be released, and there'll be a ceasefire, sort of truce. But what we're hearing is that in order to keep his government together, in particular to keep his finance minister on side, that Netanyahu has explicitly promised him that war will resume after those 42 days. And this, I have to say, we heard the first inklings of this yesterday. There were two separate groups, very small groups of family members of hostages who were invited to meet with Netanyahu. And they each left those meetings very unsettled, including some who are well-known supporters of Netanyahu, who said that he refused to answer their most serious questions and that they fear that this will be just a one-phase truce. That, from the Israeli point of view, the implication is that 65 hostages are simply going to be abandoned in Gaza and that war will return. From Hamas' point of view, if this were to happen, there are also certain benefits because it will allow Hamas's militants to regroup during these 42 days, and it will leave intact the governing structure of Hamas led by Mohammed Sinwar that is still in Gaza. And one of the stumbling blocks in recent days has been getting those Gaza-based Hamas leaders to agree, because previously it was their foreign, their more finance types who had agreed.
So you mentioned the finance minister. We're talking about Bezalel Smotrich, the far-right politician, on whom Netanyahu is dependent to retain power. I mean, it seems every time we talk, the failure for progress or peace is contingent upon who Netanyahu relies on to stay in power.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say a few harsh things now, but I think they're important to say for the record. Netanyahu has made an explicit choice. He was legally and legitimately elected. But since then, he has, attempted to enact legislation which amounts to regime change in Israel. And he has made an explicit choice, no matter the danger to his country or countrymen, to remain in power with extremists, I'm going to call them. Bezalel Smotrich is a guy who in his youth was arrested for trying to blow up the biggest highway outside of Tel Aviv. He's a theocrat. He wants to be he believes that God speaks to him about how to run the economy. We're talking about someone, he defines himself as a proud fascist homophobe. And the entire state of Israel and much of the Middle East now appears to depend on whether or not he sticks by Netanyahu. It's very important to state that on the day of the attacks of October 7th, the leader of Israel's centrist opposition, Yair Lapid, offered Netanyahu a deal that very day. Get rid of the extremists and we'll come in. We'll be in the government. And Netanyahu rejected it without batting an eyelash and has rejected it ever since. Again, just in the last week, the leader of the opposition again said that the opposition will support the government in any deal releasing hostages and would enter the government if Netanyahu got rid of these extremists. Netanyahu is unwilling to. And behind the scenes of this terrible chaos that is really tormenting the entire country, what this government is doing is passing autocratic legislation. Just today, you would think the government's busy trying to get this deal done, but just today, the government presented to the Knesset, which is Israel's parliament, a bill which, if passed, will allow the cabinet to arbitrarily halt any prosecution. So, yes, which basically will, and if this happens, if this is passed through a third reading, would make the judiciary superfluous in Israel. And there are any number of laws of this draconian sort that the government is using the current, the tension and the panic, all of these difficult emotions that Israelis are drowning under. This is what they're doing.
So I mean, the reasons for doing that, given the legal jeopardy that Netanyahu himself finds himself in, are possibly a little bit easier to work out than some of the other elements you've discussed. But to be clear, phase 2 in the current draft would see all remaining hostages released in return for a complete withdrawal from Gaza. That ain't ever going to happen.
Phase 3.
I beg your pardon, but that's never going to happen. That's not even, I mean, it's not really being reported that way over here yet, possibly for reasons of time, possibly for reasons of bias, I don't know. But that's never going to happen as things stand.
Well, this is all developed in the last hour and a half or so in Hebrew.
Yes.
Right. I mean, both sides have reasons to cause trouble.
Yes.
Both sides have reason to want to take advantage of the first 42 days, but then retain power and go back to fighting. And there appears to be, thus far, no one who can force them. Now, very few people at this point have much leverage over what's left of Hamas in Gaza, including Qatar, appears to not have as much leverage as it once did. But then you have the Trump element. What shifted the tone here in Israel was a visit on Saturday by Steve Witkoff, who will be Donald Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, who, as we understand it, showed up in Jerusalem on a Saturday for just a few hours and basically told Netanyahu that he had no choice but to get this done.
Right.
And implied that Israel would pay a price if not. Now, what will happen if Donald Trump is already president on the 42nd day and war resumes is very unclear. I don't think Israel can maintain a war at the pace it was combating for the past 15 months without American support. So we really are in a kind of limbo now.
And it would be irresponsible to speculate on how that might end.
Yeah, and if you allow me, I'd like to just point out one other thing that's happening here. The families of these hostages, it's true, in a country of 10 million people are a small minority. Let's say we're talking about 100, 150 families. But the torture that is being done to them by their own government, it's really something to see. I can't almost describe it. The government is dragging them into meetings with Netanyahu, who basically is saying to their face, well, we're going to get some of them out. You won't know if they're alive or dead or if they belong to you or to you or to you.
Gosh.
It's a kind of, and family members are calling it Netanyahu's Schindler's List. It's simply mind-boggling. So you have these people who have to, and by the way, many of them are parents of conscripted soldiers, 18, 19-year-olds, who were drafted by this country and who are simply being abandoned in Gaza and whose families are being dangled as if from strings for the next God knows how many days to wait and see if their kids or if their elderly parents come out and if they're alive or dead. The fact that the government is doing this and humiliating and tormenting these people so publicly is really, I mean, a measure of how crass and how violent internally things have turned in Israel. And I just felt the need to mention it because
Yes,
I don't think I've seen something like this before.
And it's not over yet, Noga.
Nope.
Thank you.
I'm sorry for such a report.
Well, I'm sorry as well that you have to make it because nobody wants to be. And Marita puts it very well. She says Noga's reports are excellent, but heartbreaking. And I think that's a neat summation of what we hear. Noga, stay safe and take care. Noga Tarnapolsky, there, freelance journalist in Jerusalem, talking us through some of the detail. I'll provide a little more because, understandably, when we use the word hostage, we focus upon Israelis being held in Gaza. But the numbers in phase 1 of this deal are quite interesting. So the 33, and as Noga has told us, no one has any way of knowing whether or not the people they're pledging to release will be alive or dead. But it does include a pledge, I think, to free all living female soldiers, up to the number included in the number of 33. But I don't know that this is something that's mentioned often enough. So Israel has agreed under phase 1 to free 30 Palestinian women, children or elderly for each living civilian hostage that is freed. And for each female soldier freed, Israel will release 50 Palestinian prisoners, including 30 serving life sentences. And again, in exchange for bodies handed over by Hamas, Israel will free all women and children it has detained from Gaza since the war began on October the 7th. So the simple fact of Israel imprisoning Palestinian children on a grand enough scale to constitute a crucial part of this negotiation, I think, I cautiously suggest, is something you probably haven't read or had mentioned to you very often in the context of following events in the Middle East. 12:48 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 12:51. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Cause, as you will not be surprised to learn, very close to my heart, unfolds today, the 15th of January. Of course, voluntary adoption agencies across the UK join forces for a big national campaign, Big Adoption Day 2025. It has one key purpose, which is to highlight the need for more adoptive families, more families to come forward for children at a time when thousands of children are still waiting in care. As is often the case with matters adoption related, the idea, the scheme, the initiative, there you go, got there in the end, is led by Coram, a charity that you know I am very admiring of and very lightly involved with. And they will lead an initiative that's with the consortium of voluntary adoption agencies that will see in-person and online events up and down the country in local areas. There'll be celebrations of real-life stories of families who have adopted. And the idea is to encourage anyone interested in exploring adoption to find out more. Carol Holden is the chief executive, CEO of Coram, a charity I mentioned earlier, actually, in a completely different context, which grew out of the charity set up by Sir Thomas Coram, a sea captain who dedicated his life to looking after what were known at the time as foundlings, children who had been abandoned or given up, often by very, very loving parents. You know that from some of the records that the charity still holds, and which has evolved over a very, very long time into a charity that today focuses chiefly on the kind of matters that we're seeking to draw attention to today. Carol, thank you for joining us. How, given the years that you've worked in this field, how does the situation today with regard to the numbers waiting to be adopted and the speed or the rate at which families keen to adopt come forward, are we in a good, a bad, or an indifferent place at the moment?
We're in a place where we need to do more together because there are more children in the care system than ever before. But at the present time, the fewest of them, the lowest number for decades, are leaving care to adoption. And part of that is that we need to encourage more adopters to come forwards who may be able to provide those loving homes. So just in the last year, we have seen there be 700 more children waiting. And so, and most of these children that I want to convey, the vast majority of these children are aged under 5. Do we think you're too old at 5? Some of them will be in sibling groups, of course. And so, we all know how important trying to match children together is. But the fact is that there's a very high interest in adoption, that remains high, but we urge people to come forwards, not be discouraged by the myths or concerns that they may have about process, and just work with us to consider whether it is right for them to expand their family or form their family in this way.
Do you want to say a word about some of those myths? Do you want to explode some of those canals?
Yes, indeed. I mean, one of them is the phrase is, it's very difficult to adopt. Well, I would point out to you that it is the duty of our statutory services to make sure that a child that's had such a difficult chance start in life, that the maximum support is given and preparation is given to make sure that adoption works for them. Secondly, I would say adoption is not for the many, it is for the few, children and families. And therefore it's right to take some time together to make sure it is right for you. But it doesn't take longer to prepare to adopt than it does to get pregnant and give birth. But of course, it is a journey of understanding. of what adoption may mean. And the key thing is that Coram, as all the voluntary and other adoption agencies, it is our job to help you in that journey and to stand by your side. So someone said just recently that that which is worth having will be demanding. Yes, and having a child in your family for life, that is worth having.
Another element that perhaps some people may benefit from knowing more about is the fact that the role of organisations like Coram and other adoption agencies doesn't end with the arrival of the child in the new home.
No, indeed. I mean, that is the start.
Yes.
So there's a great deal of work to prepare. And then at Coram, we provide training and support, but we then also provide additional groups, peer support groups, dedicated social workers, specialist parenting programs, for example, when children reach adolescence. And we do also have our own therapeutic service to which there can be referral if that is needed. And it is really important when you are embarking upon this journey to have confidence in the fact that we will be by your side throughout that journey.
Exactly.
We're currently conducting what's known as longitudinal research, tracking the experiences of families in Coram over 30 years.
Yes.
And our children are now parents.
Well, this is something that even adoptees of my generation don't fully appreciate, and I wouldn't know about if it wasn't for my association with you and with Coram. And when you meet some of the young people who you retain contact with and encourage to come together, you realise that it's an adoption isn't just for Christmas, is it, Carol? It's for life.
It is. It's the unique thing that is for life.
Yes.
So for a child in the care system, there are wonderful foster carers, and I commend you to consider that. Sometimes residential care may be necessary for the most complex needs, but adoption is the only really permanent way in which a child finds the new family that they need forever.
How can people whose interest we may have piqued in the course of this short conversation find out more?
You can find out more by visiting coram.org.uk. And please do come to one of our information evenings and just explore whether it may be right for you.
And we will be on stage at the National Theatre later today. I thought many years ago, Carol, that it would be to deliver my Hamlet when I made my debut at the National Theatre, but sadly not. We'll be conducting an event and then attending a special performance of Ballet Shoes. Just tell us a little bit about that.
The National Theatre, most wonderfully, of course, some years ago did produce Coram Boy, which tells the story of Coram and the founding hospital. So we consider we have a very special friendship with them. But how marvellous that they have chosen to work with Coram to celebrate Big Adoption Day with free tickets and support and platform performances, thank you, James, for adoptive families. Because the story of Ballet Shoes is a story of adoption. It is the story of the fact that a family is those who love you and that you love, and that can be expanded and formed, and that if you find those that love you and you find a thing that you love, the world can be your stage.
Beautifully put. I'll see you later, Carol. Thank you.
See you later, James.
Coram.org.uk if you want to find out more about this. And don't be cross if I squeeze in a soliloquy just before we call time on proceedings. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts, including the brand new James O'Brien Daily. James O'Brien Daily, the best bits of my show, it says here, in 60 minutes. But I know what you're thinking, and you're right. Far too many best bits to cram into 60. So it's some of the best bits, even every day, though. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. But now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.